To Fangs and Folklore, which is an event in 2 festivals. It's in, well, this kind of programme, Dracula Returns to Derby, but it's also in the Being Human festival. Now, Being Human happens every year, and we've had some funding to put this on. I'll explain Dracula Returns to Derby in a little bit, but first of all, I have to sort of explain this. And we're starting a little bit late because we actually did have 60 people booked to come, but of course free events, you know, some people, it's early on a Saturday, but here we go. And hopefully, Dan, this should play. Yes, all right. I've not seen this before, so I've got to show you this. Wonderful. So, that is the Being Human Festival, who we are very, very happy to be part of. Now, today's event, little bit about who's who. My name is Matthew Cheeseman. I'm working on this project, Dracula Returns to Derby. I work as a Professor of Writing and Folklore at the University of Derby. I'm a council member of the Folklore Society. More of that later. Also here is Alexandra Dey. There's Alex. Alex is a novelist. She is also doing a PhD in creative writing at the University of Derby. She's a reader for the Cheshire Novel Prize for Kids. Dan, where's Dan Webber? There's Dan. Some of you may know Dan. Dan is also part of Dracula Returns to Derby. He's the events officer at Derby Museums, and he is the director of the Derby Poetry Festival. And if you have any questions about this wonderful building that we are in, or the work of Derby Museums, please ask Dan. And then we have Kath Feely, who is not in this room. She is running an event at the Museum of Making, and she is coordinating Being Human for the University of Derby. She is a senior lecturer in history. But, okay, enough of Kath, Dan, and me. Alex is definitely a big draw here, but the 3 names here are the people you are here to hear. We have Dr Juliette Wood, who's a folklorist and Celtic scholar, a lecturer at Cardiff University, and a council member of the Folklore Society, and an ex-president, Juliette, is that right? Yes, there we go. We have Jeremy Harte, a curator of Bourne Hall Museum, a prolific author, a recent book you may be interested in on place names associated with the devil. He also convenes the legendary weekends for the Folklore Society. If you like this event, then you will like the legendary weekends that Jeremy curates. And you should get in touch with him in the break and ask him about how to attend those. And then we have Dr Gail-Nina Anderson, who is there at the back, yes. And Gail-Nina is an art historian and lectures on the intersections of folklore and art history and many things besides. Okay, so this is Bram Stoker. He was a theatre critic. He was a personal assistant of a very famous actor and the owner of the Lyceum, Sir Henry Irving. He wrote in his spare time. And Dracula was by no means his only novel. I think he published 13 novels, appropriately, something like that. He published Dracula, I think his third novel, or thereabouts, on the 26th of May, 1897. And he struggled to adapt it for the theatre. Although he did read it on stage a week before it was published on the 18th of May to secure copyright. And that is very important in our story in Derby, copyright. Because 100 years ago, this novel, Dracula, was first performed on the stage in this building, the Grand Theatre on Babington Lane in this city. And there we go, there's an advert. Florence Stoker, Bram's widow, granted Hamilton Dean the rights to adapt Dracula. Hamilton Dean was Irish, he used to work with Bram Stoker, so there was a sort of link. Hamilton Dean's adaptation changed the character, it changed the story. Dracula was not as monstrous, but sort of suave and sensual and a bit of an aristocrat. There's the Grand Theatre today, the House of Holes, one of Derby's two adults-only crazy golf venues. So here's Hamilton Dean, and he played Van Helsing 100 years ago. And it's from his 1924 play that we have Dracula, the suave and handsome count. Instead of beginning in Transylvania and landing at Whitby, and invading England, curtain goes up, Dracula is wearing a cape, a tuxedo. He's part of London society already. So you see how the character changes. And this is the character that is enacted in folk costume at Halloween in fancy dress. It became a sensation. It toured the country. It eventually transferred to the West End. Broadway got interested, and the play went over to New York. In New York, Bela Lugosi was cast in essentially the same script that started in Derby. Bela Lugosi toured the United States, stopped off in Hollywood, and was cast in the 1931 adaptation. And the rest is history. Dracula becomes one of the most famous fictional characters to emerge from Britain, or Transylvania, however you see it. Something happened here in Derby. He's less of a monster in the novel. He's a horrible, some say anti-Semitic stereotype that changes as the novel progresses, but nevertheless is there. In Derby, there's something much more about the romantic vampire that happened on stage here. Something, and you'll recognise this as Lord Byron, of course. The vampire is an outsider, a kind of cool. The cool happens in Derby, the cool vampire. And so the character opens up from Derby on. This urbane, much less monstrous Dracula becomes Dracula the playboy, Dracula the lounge lizard, and even Dracula the hardcore porn star. So what I like to say is whenever there is a return to the monstrous in Dracula, it's a return to the novel, but the softening of the character begins in Derby. Right, so there's the Derby Dracula. That's first played by Edmund Blake. That's not pictured there. We don't have a picture of Edmund Blake playing Dracula. That's Raymond Huntley. So, two things to remember today. The character of Dracula, and then Dracula the story, two different things. So, there's all sorts of Draculas. You'll recognise some of them. Some of them are doing things with the character of Dracula. They're changing who the character is. I'm talking from a creative writing perspective here, right? Some of them are doing things with the story of Dracula. Whoops. They're keeping the story, but they're maybe changing it. And they're always doing both. So the character and the story, two different things to think about. If you're interested in reading more about Dracula, I am running a reading group at Thrive Mind Village. The next one is on the 28th of November. We're reading the Derby script. So if you want to get involved in that, then just email dracula@derby.ac.uk and he will answer they will answer your email. So there's a sort of writing element to today's talk. We're going to hear from three folklorists, three experts, but we're also going to be thinking creatively as we do so. As writers, what can we do with the character of Dracula, with vampires? What can we do with the story of Dracula? That story of invasion. Does it begin in Transylvania and he invades London? He takes over London. He's stealing our women. Or is he part of London? Or is he just a friend, a father figure? Dracula is a very numerous character. What is Dracula's visual iconography? So important in Derby because you're putting it on stage. What can we use from folklore? And what, as creatives, can we just make up? Right, that's good. We can make up things as writers. We don't have to stick to the sources. So, Fangs and Folklore. This is our event. Did Bram Stoker read any folklorists in order to write Dracula? What did he invent outright? What did he develop? How old is traditional belief in vampires? Where do the stories come from? We're exploring these and other questions across 3 in-depth talks. They're 45 minutes long. I believe we have tea and coffee. Is that right? We have tea and coffee in the break, so you're allowed, do go. I think it's free. The tea and coffee is free. The biscuits, there should be biscuits that we've brought as well. So do go and get a tea and coffee. Yeah, and that will be the refreshments for the day. And there'll be a chance to talk to all of the authors. This is our, and I know we're running a bit late, but we're going to have Juliette Wood first. We'll have some time for questions, reflection, and writing. I might truncate that a little. Then we're going to have Jeremy Harte, some further questions, reflection and writing, refreshment and a 45-minute break before Gail-Nina Anderson will take us through the visual side of Dracula to end with. And then with questions, reflection and writing and end. I'm so sorry, going to have to leave at lunch because one of my closest friends who I've known since I was 7 has decided to get married he's just sort of announced his marriage 6 weeks ago due to legal reasons. I won't go into them now. But I'm going to attend the end of his reception. I'm going to miss his wedding, but never mind. I hope that's okay, and I'm sorry for all that. So, without further ado, Dan, would you help transfer the slides over to Juliette? I would like everyone to please give a warm welcome to Dr Juliette Wood of Cardiff University. And I don't know whether you want that there, Juliette.
Actually, my voice could probably carry.
But we're recording it. And I will say that, actually. This is being recorded. Is it being live streamed? Yes. It's being live streamed. So maybe the people who aren't here are just at home with their sandwiches, bacon sandwiches, watching it. And it's being live streamed by Fuse Media, Derby's premier videography and live event technicians. Okay, over to Juliette.
Right.
There's your clicker.
What do I do?
Very simply. Useless. That, forward, back.
Right. I'm useless with technology. As a medievalist, the inventing of printing is my idea of where we should have stopped. Is it? Right, let me sort of also get this sorted. And can everyone hear me? Right. Well, as you can see, I've started with who's in charge of the blood bank. And one of the things I want to look at is what is the kernel of the structure of Dracula that allows us to develop it in different ways. So it's something that will fit in very well with anyone who's doing creative writing. And I have to say, when Matt first presented this topic to the Folklore Society, my initial reaction was vampires and Derby. But on learning that Derby provided an important conduit for the introduction of what has now become an increasingly proliferating popular icon, I now look forward to seeing the current version of the play, which will be in Cardiff in 2 weeks, and I have a ticket. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now, I want to start just briefly talking about the folklore. The novel and other iterations use a certain amount of Eastern folklore. And what it was about the way they used this is that this was an exotic, something exotic, an outsider, and incorporating this exotic lore into vampire tales both defined and controlled our relationship with it. And basically, that's one of the ground themes of all of the Dracula stories, all of the vampire stories. But the vampire trope also drew on assumptions about the supernatural, which are native to Western Europe, especially ideas about revenants and antagonistic liminal spirits. Now, my introduction to the vampire mythos was neither Stoker's novel nor the Hammer horror films. Rather, it was M.R. James's Gothic fiction, and more to the point, his extensive medieval learning. He was a very impressive medieval scholar, as evidenced by the translation of Walter Mapp's A Courtier's Trifles, De Nudis Corialium. This is an elegant, unfinished 12th century collection of anecdotes collected by the courtier, one of Henry II's courtiers, Walter Mapp. It was published in the 1920s with folklore notes by E. Sidney Hartland, one of the early presidents of the Folklore Society. Now, there are several medieval anecdotes about revenants, which are basically semi-corporeal undead who've led awful lives and have come back to harass the living, which is as good a working definition as any. Mapp's text recommends cutting the revenant's neck, sprinkling it with holy water, and reburying it. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Hartland's extensive folklore notes contextualize these incidents within a growing body of research on vampire traditions and an awareness of the figure in literature. The etymology of vampire, and many of its characteristics, is rooted in late 17th and early 18th century Slavic Europe. The authors who made this information available to European literary tradition and to Stoker were either Enlightenment writers who proposed logical explanations, hence the ideas of premature burial and catatonia, and counter-Enlightenment writers who focused on the superstitions of the ignorant and peasant communities at the edge of Western Europe, basically, but refused to deny spiritual reality. That said, Dracula and his vampire horde have significant antecedents in older texts, and beyond them, when one considers West African vampire-like entities outside the Western cultural zone. So it's not primarily a Western cultural tradition, even though it begins to pick these up very, very early on. Classical, this is Walter Mapp writing, supposedly. This is the first edition of De Nudis Corialium in 1914, and the later one with the folklore notes. There's an earlier one after that as well, but we won't worry about that. So what happens? The antecedents in Western culture, classical culture, contains several dangerous entities, spiritual rather than undead humans. They're kind of liminal spirits, not sort of the undead, who feed on human essence, and for the most part, they're female. So really it starts off as a female creature preying on men. The story of one of these, who's an Ampusa or a Lamia, depending on what you want to call her, is in the form of a beautiful woman who seduces a young man and intends to kill him by sort of cannibalizing him, basically. And she's frustrated by the intervention of a philosopher who has knowledge of what she is and knowledge of the occult. Now, interestingly, this really anticipates Stoker's story, although Stoker wouldn't have known this story, and actually many of the subsequent literary vampire stories. And what you get, and I think this is the key narrative here, is a fascinating but evil entity who threatens an innocent and is opposed by a psychic practitioner of some kind. And this creates a fairly stable narrative pattern of demonic antagonist, potential victim, and occult opposer, basically. And this pattern, which is a folklorist, I would like to foreground rather here the folk beliefs as sources for vampire fiction. Now, these predatory females remained popular. There are several German versions, which predate Stoker's novel, Goethe's Bride of Corinth, Le Fano's Carmilla, Dumas' The Pale Lady. These are all sort of late 18th into the middle of the 19th century. Poe's Lenore and Ligeia, and I could go on and on and on. And they certainly have continued, are still getting them. But the significant alternative was introduced in 1819, at the famous sort of gore fest at the Villa Diodati. And here you can see some of the 18th century sort of vampire frights in Silesia and places like that. And in the middle is an illustration of Goethe's Bride of Corinth. This is Carmilla, the famous one. And what's interesting about that is you can see the triangle here. In the door comes the occult practitioner, ready to save Carmilla from the vampire. The other thing that Lefano introduces is the idea of lesbianism within the vampire story. And he introduces it very, very subtly. An incredible story, and if anyone in the room hasn't read it, please do. It is absolutely, absolutely wonderful. There's no illustration of Dumas' The Pale Lady, but it was a very famous story in its day. Dumas' a bit out of fashion, which is a shame, because he's really good. This is Munch's The Vampire, redheads. I don't know why redheads have such a bad reputation, but I object to that on very obvious grounds. And this is Kipling and the vampire. And again, there's that very sort of erotic picture of the vampire. I mean, subtle it always isn't. It's this kind of interpretations that try to bring out the subtleness of it. Also, I think to mention that Lefano establishes the idea of the psychic practitioner. He wasn't the first one to do it, but that's the point at which the kind of Van Helsing, what becomes the Van Helsing figure, gets put in. Now, a native vampire tradition does not seem to have been strong in Britain. Lots of revenants, but not the typical fanged, blood-sucking creature, which sort of makes the notes about the vampires in the 1920 edition of Map so very striking. By this time, there was an idea of what a vampire should be, and it was starting to be back projected onto the revenant. There's a very good suggestion that the vampire is basically the 18th century type of revenant that you found in Silesia. Good reason for that. But by the turn of the 20th century, it was an established literary figure, as I say, at the center of a recognizable plot structure. And I will keep coming back to that because my argument in this paper is that you really can't understand how the vampire changes without understanding what this key plot structure is. Now, Polidori's vampire, this is the Nosferatu, and a picture of the poster of the Nosferatu film, which is coming out at the beginning of the year, I think. This is Polidori, there's Byron, there's Polidori, there's a couple of illustrations. Polidori's vampire was very much mad, bad, and dangerous to know. The male character, Aubrey, is always sort of agonizing morally about this, and the female character pretty much just stands there and gets bitten. And it ends with that wonderful line, she had glutted the thirst of a vampire, just in case you miss the sexual implications of what is going on, which you pretty well can't do. But it's very interesting how Polidori characterizes the vampire. Dead gray eyes, deadly hue of face, although the form and outline were beautiful. So he's attractive to women, he has a reputation for persuasiveness. Special attention is made of the power of his glance. And you get this, you can recognize the romantic figure, not just of the Byronic hero, but sort of the anti-hero, the Gothic anti-hero generally. And particularly what was being sort of foregrounded here is the egotism of this particular character. It's a very narcissistic sort of image. It's kind of become, I think, these tales has become a kind of archetypal point of departure for this sort of thing. And it allows us to appreciate what is happening in literature. The shift from Nosferatu, this is again material which Matt has gone over, so I will skip over that. It allows us to sort of see how this has developed. You have an early sort of version of Stoker with Dracula crawling down the wall, still white-haired and a bit sort of unpleasantly scary, as Stoker's novel was. You have Bela Lugosi, you have Christopher Lee, and that is the Frank Langella one, which is the image on my T-shirt. which I wore a lot when I first got it, and now kind of keep it carefully hidden in a drawer because it's become a bit sort of worn and precious. So we can understand what is happening here, and I think we can understand it because of what is going on. A certain kind of actor is always cast as Dracula, and this is just an example of them. Louis Jourdain, who did the television one with this lovely sort of French accent, which went very, very well for exotic without sort of having to put on an artificial Hungarian one, and various other ones. And that's Frank Langella when he was young and very, very striking. On stage, Frank Langella has the most amazing presence. I mean, he's good as a film actor, but I've seen him in several things, not just as Dracula on stage, and he really just comes across. So you have that. Now, the other thing that happens, because we know what kind of actors are going to be cast as Dracula, we can begin to understand the comedy. This is Dead and Loving It, which is sort of Leslie Nielsen. But more to the point is this not always successful film called Love at First Bite, which has George Hamilton. And the reason George Hamilton is so perfect is even by the time he was filmed, I mean, he was so well preserved, he could easily be a vampire. And I mean, I think that's the kind of meta game that film plays, is that you see this actor who is just, well, too handsome to be real, and in many ways actually isn't real. The other thing that again, which we get, are these sort of comedy ones, being Human, What We Do in the Shadows, and the Hotel Transylvania. We find them funny, or not, depending on whether we like comedy or not, but we understand what's going on because we know what a vampire is supposed to be, and we know what's supposed to happen. And when it doesn't happen, we think, either they've done a good satire, or, oh heavens, I want to, turn over the page quickly. I want actually now to look more seriously at a couple of films, particularly ones that I like, that vary this way of doing the vampire and allow us to see what happens if you have in your head this particular narrative and you sort of twist it round. And I've given a couple of ones that I like. Abel Ferrara, The Addiction. A philosophy student, we're back to someone who is rational, gets bitten by a vampire, a woman philosophy student bitten by a female vampire, a very beautiful female vampire, Annabella Shora. She goes around trying to avoid being a vampire, but it becomes an addiction. And she can't quite clear it. And there's also something which you always find in Abel Ferrara films, is he's very interested in original sin. A lot of things are set in sort of Roman Catholic settings. This one as well. So it's this sense of she's kind of rediscovering the original pollution, which is actually in her. I won't tell you the ending. Abel Ferrara films need to be sort of looked at and really looked at. He's not an easy filmmaker. The central one is another interesting one. It's a neo-Western, basically. Lance Henriksen leads a group of vampires who travel around the West, sort of creating chaos, basically, in a camper van with the windows sort of closed out with aluminium foil so that the sunlight doesn't get in. And again, Lance Henriksen, if you look at him, he's another one of those actors who looks Dracula, striking face. Not conventionally good looking, but very, very striking. The music for this is interesting as well. It's prog rock, it's Tangerine Dream. So it kind of contrasts with the Western. It also begins to introduce something which I think is very characteristic of postmodern vampires, and why I've called my talk, Who's in Charge of the Blood Bank, in that if you're going to kind of put the vampire into the 21st century and make him or her less of a threat, you've got to do something about the blood. You've got to do something about the blood sucking. And in this instance, the girl vampire who falls in love with the boy who's, again, like so many heroes in these, just a bit wimpish. You wonder why they prefer Dracula? No, I won't go there. What happens at the end is there's a blood transfusion, basically. His blood is transfused into her, and she becomes human again. So you get this notion of the vampire being able to redeem himself or herself. The Hunger is another rather interesting one, a rather straightforwardly erotic one. But it's also quite interesting because the female vampire predates the male vampire, and the female victim predates the female vampire. I think I've got that right, but I'm sure you can figure it out. So again, they're playing around with the vampire one. This one ends, whether badly or not, it certainly ends with the female victim in control of the two other vampires. And again, you have to know what is supposed to happen to realize why it doesn't. And of course, again, the film background to this, Bela Lugosi's dead, is another kind of meta comment on what is happening in the film. Particularly interesting in postmodern vampires are the kind of series that you get. Partly, I think this is responding to modern media. Netflix and places like that like series. They make more money doing that. They can get people coming back for more. Publishers like it because they can publish things. And I suspect authors like it as well because they can write more books as long as they can sustain the image. Anne Rice is quite interesting here. She really creates an alternative world. And this is another kind of postmodern thing which is being dragged into the vampire mythos. Modern fantasy talks a lot about primary and secondary worlds. Tolkien being a primary world because there's no reference to the outside, and Lewis being kind of secondary world because they go from being the normal world into something else. She really creates almost an image of that, in that you get several different times, you get several different countries, you get sort of things like Antonio Banderas, who again is a perfect vampire figure, isn't he? In the chapel where actually the Grand Guignol plays were staged in 19th century Paris. And although there were no vampires in these, there was plenty of blood and guts. They lived, the chapel was next to a slaughterhouse. So when people were chopped up on stage, they had bits. They had bits from the slaughterhouse that was sort of chopped up on stage. It went until after the Second World War, when sort of looking back on this, and the fact that the Nazis rather liked this, it was closed and people thought, no, we're not going to have any more of that. It's coming back in many ways. Also, you get this notion, yes, that's right, I'll stand back a bit because I have to keep turning to see the pictures. You get this notion of a vampire who can be redeemed. Anne Rice is the last couple of books in this series. Lestat is being redeemed. Anne Rice actually reconverted to Catholicism, and she changed the direction, and she tried to see how to redeem a vampire by making them become human in some ways. There's some very interesting examples of that. The primary one is Caspar David Friedrich's The Wanderer, the great sort of expressionist notion. Not a Byronic hero, but a complete outsider, an outsider who isn't in control. Very different, I think, from the Byronic hero. And this, I think, makes a very good image for the vampire. You get it, if you think about Charlotte Bronte's Mr. Rochester. What's beginning to happen, and I think the basic structure is changing here. It's beginning to kind of meld with the Gothic, and particularly with the popular Gothic, where the hero in the Gothic, and as I say, Mr. Rochester is probably the best example, is a man who needs to be redeemed, who kind of senses that he has to be redeemed, but has some kind of secret. And it's very easy to put a vampire in that position, which indeed they do. And two examples, I don't know whether you've seen Forever Night. It was a Canadian series in the early 90s. And it's an 800-year-old vampire who's become a detective in Toronto, I think. And he's trying to solve crimes so he can purge the fact that he's killed all of these people and become human, the redeemed vampire. Same thing with Deborah Harkness's Matthew character in A Discovery of Witches, who is a vampire who is becoming redeemed by falling in love with a witch. It's, it goes off in all sorts of directions. But basically, it's this notion that what's the vampire going to do to redeem himself? Well, the first thing he's got to do is stop drinking blood or get the blood elsewhere. Hence, the picture at the beginning of this, which is from True Blood, which is sort of the True Blood substitute, which is really advertised like a non-alcoholic beer. This film, which I, again, highly recommend if you haven't seen it, is one of Val Lewton's films, done in 1948. Val Lewton was a Ukrainian-American. It dawned on me when I was doing this that the Ukrainian is probably rather more significant now than it would have been a little while ago. Ukrainian-American. This film was 1948, so it's just a few years after the end of the war. And why I'm suggesting it is it's really more about revenants than vampires. And the opening scene, which I think is voiced over, says, and I will step back without falling off, I hope, under conquest and oppression, the people of Greece allowed their legends to degenerate into superstition. The goddess Aphrodite giving way to the Veronica, this nightmare figure, was very much alive in the minds of the peasant when Greece fought the victorious War of 1912. References to the war that's just finished? Yes. References to communism? Yes. Lewton was very good at getting these messages into these Hollywood films. The advertisements for the film, well, there's one of them. Iron hero driven berserk by wandering corpses and vampires. I mean, it was the, would it be easier if I held it? Sorry about that. Right. Yes? This way I can turn round. Otherwise we're getting lost. This is how it was advertised. There's no blood-sucking vampire in this. What there is Karloff playing a general in this strange island, and it opens with the picture of Arnold Böcklin's Isle of the Dead, and they're sailing towards this. The story revolves around a young woman who is looking after an older woman who is subject to catatonic fits and is terrified that she is going to be buried prematurely. Around this is the notion that this young woman, who's young and healthy and beautiful, is sucking the life out of this old woman. It's not what's happened, but the peasants keep telling her this, and the peasants all look a bit like medieval witches. And Boris Karloff falls for this. So it really is a kind of, not very hidden, but I think quite subtle parable on the dangers of sort of othering people. And given what's just happened and what was happening in Ukraine at the time, you can see what Lewton is coming from. But as I say, the advertisement for it presents it as a horror film. It's very, very effective. But as I say, it's one of the few vampire films which really is revenant. There's no blood-sucking whatsoever. There's some wonderful photography. Needless to say, the woman is prematurely buried and kind of runs around, kind of attacking various people. I won't spoil the ending. Obviously, it has a happy ending. They always did. The other film, which I certainly classify as vampire films, is Kronos. Guillermo del Toro is absolutely wonderful. And in this one, you get this sort of notion of alchemy and vampirism. The links between the vampire mythos or vampire-like mythos and what was happening in Europe. And in this case, the story is of an elderly man with a young granddaughter, so you get the old and young image. He finds this strange object, which was invented by an alchemist and lost. And what it is an insect, basically. And the insect, it's wonderfully creepy. I'm not particularly fond of bugs, so I particularly found this bit was kind of, oh God, I know what's going to happen. Grabs onto him and starts sucking his blood. And he begins to become young. But he also begins to have a fascination with blood. I haven't put up the picture because it is so grotesque. At one point, he chases someone into the men's room, and the man has sort of bled onto this marble top, and he starts licking up the blood. And I have to say, it is one of the scariest images. At the end, the man is rescued by his granddaughter, so it ends sort of happily. But again, you can see how these things relate more to the vampire mythos than the actual horror vampire. We then have the complete change. I think this is where, and Anne Rice is part of this as well, where you begin to have this sort of change where the vampire becomes the cute boyfriend. A lot of the analysis, the academic analysis of The Lost Boys, talks about how it came during the AIDS epidemic. It was the sort of problems of contemporary adolescence. I saw it with my 3 teen nieces when they were at the height of their cute boy syndrome. I almost disowned them. And I wasn't the only adult female in the film who kind of wanted to disown their young relatives. It's very, very difficult now for me to think of this as AIDS, as anything other than a real change which occurs in the vampire mythos, is that it begins to address itself to a much younger audience. And that younger audience is not as receptive to the kind of horror messages that we had before. They want to see these as the kind of bad boys that they can date. And needless to say, they always do, despite the fact that mother says, no, you oughtn't go with that boy. And as I say, do take an adolescent to see The Lost Boys, and I'm sure I will convince you that's what's happened. And then, of course, you get Angel and Spike. You get the Buffy the Vampire one, where again, you get this kind of high school boys. Is a question, do you prefer Spike, who is much rougher, or Angel, who's a sweetheart? Well, I leave it to you. I keep doing that, don't I? The melodrama is coming out here. We're kind of going back to one of the earlier elements of the vampire world. This is Varney the Vampire at the Feast of Blood, which I'm sure Gail-Nina will tell you about. It's quite wonderful. It wasn't intended to be serious. We think the author for this one also wrote Sweeney Todd. It was that kind of thing. And that kind of becomes a kind of baseline. And some of the later Hammer films are very, very melodramatic. Christopher Lee said he got really tired of just having to kind of put on the fangs and glower at the camera and not really have much to do with the plot. And I mean, it's this sort of thing. It's the Anne Radcliffe. We're back to what happens with Anne Radcliffe. She presents her Gothic villains as sort of examples of materialism. In The Mysteries of Udolpho, Montoni is the Italian count. He exploits everyone. He marries a wealthy woman. He wastes her money. And she parallels it with a character, Valancourt, who is kind of the perfect marriage partner, noble and good, even though he doesn't have a lot of money and doesn't come from good family, and is dull as ditch water. But, I mean, that's the 18th century Gothic, basically. But if you kind of mix that with the popular Gothic, if Montoni becomes Mr. Rochester rather than sort of a decadent Italian count, if you make the hero the kind of Mr. Rochester figure, if you kind of change the way these motifs are kind of arranged, you get the kind of characters which were sort of very, very much in the kind of popular pulp Gothic novels of the 1970s. I know I went through dozens and dozens of them. I can't really remember the specific plot of any of them because they were always the same. Girl running across the top of the book, a sort of spooky house with one lit window. And basically what happens is she gets in touch with this sort of character who's very handsome and a little sort of mysterious, and they end up sort of happily married, and that's that. One or two of them referenced vampires, that one, for example. But you also find it in The Curse of Collingwood. It was an American daytime soap about vampires, which was unusual in and of itself. And it was so popular that they kind of ran out of plot. So they had to move it from current day America to 19th century America. And they ran out of plot again, and they had to move it to 18th century America. And then they just ran out of American history, and they moved it into another dimension. But what happened is something the writers just did not expect, is that people thought it was wonderful. It was terrible. My father and brother loved it, and my mother and I used to sort of wander in and out making snarky comments. I mean, it really was, even for daytime soaps, the effects were terrible. They kept tripping over the scenery. And although this actor was a well-known actor, the acting wasn't up to much, but it was compulsive viewing. So here we have a real change of what postmodern vampire does. Again, things like The Vampire Diaries, also addressed to a kind of what is called a YA audience, a remark which I actually dislike because it's a young adult audience, basically. And children a lot younger than young adults are perfectly capable of dealing with this without having their psyches destroyed by either the sex or the horror. But that's one of my hobby horses, that it's misnamed. Southern vampire mysteries are the same thing. And this is particularly where she brings in just about every supernatural kind of being there is, centered around the vampires who are trying desperately to, well, some of them not so desperately, who are trying to become part of modern society and who they'll drink this blood substitute, this true blood, as I say, the non-alcoholic beer. What happens, the last one, and I will sort of finish here, you kind of recognize now what are vampire things. These are 2 Jellycat toys, flavor of the month toys. Alas, I don't have any grandchildren or godchildren young enough to buy them for, and I have so far resisted from buying them for myself. Halloween costumes. The vampire has nothing to do with Halloween. The references, the folk references to vampire, the traditions about vampire, associate him with St. George's Day, which is the spring. It's very much that kind of figure rather than a Halloween figure. But he's now become part of Halloween. And there are sort of plenty of kids. I particularly like the toddler vampire. I think he's rather sweet. There are also all kinds of vampire toys. This actually exists, and I have a yard of that fabric. There was a very expensive interior decorators who, after the gory Dracula in New York, produced wallpaper based on Gorey's designs and fabric based on Gorey's designs. Even I would hesitate on having a room with Gorey wallpaper. I mean, much as I love Edward Gorey, but I do have a sample of the fabric. Expensive as well. It's rather an unusual one. The others are much clearer. Particularly, I like the sort of Hotel Transylvania. Because there you get this kind of single parent vampire who is sort of contending with all the problems that a single parent does. And Adam Sandler does a very, very good job of sounding bemused and slightly out of his depth at all times. But again, why is he funny? He's funny because we know what Nosferatu was. We know what the glamorous vampires were like. And we kind of look at Adam Sandler, well, we look at the vampire and we think, yeah, this works. This is our postmodern game that we can move back and forward in dealing with. I haven't really had a chance to look at 2 elements. As I say, I had to cut this down to 45 minutes. You can go on for years with vampires. One of the things that really is beginning now to come out are sort of feminist vampire stories, but quite subtle ones, for example. The Lucy Undying is basically poor Lucy and how, having become a vampire, she tries to establish a thing for herself. And the other thing is sort of ethnic writers who are beginning to do speculative fiction. Jill Gomez is particularly interesting because her book, The Gilda Stories, has just come out, or recently come out again as a 25-year edition. But when she was writing in 1991, she actually says that she got a lot of rejections. And the publishers would sort of say, you're an ethnic writer. Ethnic writing ought to be serious. You shouldn't be doing speculative fiction. Not quite as boldly as that, but that's basically what it was. And as she says, this is, in a sense, othering in and of itself. Well, you now get quite a lot of ethnic writers doing speculative fiction, so we've got beyond that. That one I recommend, it's wonderful. The other thing which is coming out with the feminist writers is allowing the female characters to be something other than victims, to be not simply female vampires, but female entities doing quite different things. And of course, it kind of plays off what I mentioned with Carmilla, which is the kind of erotic nature of the female characters. And the 2 pictures here, I think, are very sort of evocative. You have Bram Stoker's Dracula, the 2 girls looking at one another very, very closely. And the 1932 one, where the 2 of them are separated and looking in opposite directions, because in the 1930s, hints of lesbianism were just absolutely not going to go. Even though if you look at what's going on, you can see that. So these are some of the areas which I'm afraid I'm not going to have a look at. But what I am going to finish with is, who does not know who Count von Count is? And I have brought my own one, which I brought for my dear...
Do you want me to hold the mic while you put your hand in? There you go.
Thank you.
It's okay.
Come on. There we go.
Brilliant.
That's Count von Count. My eldest niece learned to count with him. She also, I have to say, had the accent for a very long time. But she was very proficient. We're quite happy when she lost the accent and kept proficient. She is a maths teacher. So clearly he had at least one success. But again, have a look at that figure. It scared nobody. It fascinated kids. It taught them something which, I have to say, schools now have problems teaching kids. But sort of deconstruct that. Here's Count von Count, here's Dracula, here's Nosferatu, here's an extremely nasty revenant who goes around sucking the life out of various people. And here is all of those wonderful postmodern characters as well. I think one could probably end by saying Dracula always comes back, doesn't he?
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Juliette. Juliette Wood, everybody, please. And just in case you didn't pick this up, the 1978, Juliette, is that right?
Yes.
Production of Dracula in New York City had sets designed by a really famous and brilliant writer and artist called Edward Gorey. And Derby Museums at Pickford's house have you could buy a kind of toy theatre for that production, and they have that in the collection, and they have it over at Pickford's house. So you can go and have a look at that toy theatre with these amazing sets, and it's also got the playbill from when Bela Lugosi came here in 1951 and played Dracula at the Hippodrome. It's also got that there. And next year, I think they're going to expand that offering. But Juliette went. Oh, okay. Sorry. I that's a hint. That was just a teaser. But the T-shirt is here because Juliette herself went to the 1976. Went to the 1976 production. So, Juliette.
I have always liked Edward Gorey. I've liked Edward Gorey because, being a ballet dancer before I was an academic, he was a great ballettomane. All his stuff is Gothic. Some of it sort of edges into sort of things, particularly his attitude to children, whom he didn't much like, that we probably wouldn't like now. But the production was wonderful. Things like when they called you back after the interval, there were wolf howls rather than bells. And again, just a family anecdote. I went with my husband. It was great, and we thought, we will take my parents to it for their anniversary. Got a lovely box, and we're in the middle of this. And again, Langella sort of goes into Lucy's bedroom, and then she's in this wonderful thing with her. And my mother says in a stage whisper, which I'm sure the entire theatre could have heard, "I think he's after more than a pint of blood." Parents' ability to embarrass their children never changes. But it was extremely good. And I think the reason it works so well is that although it was a kind of tongue-in-cheek version of Dracula with these very sort of black and white stagey sets, it was played with absolutely perfect seriousness. And I think that's kind of the best satire, when the people who are doing the satire don't keep sort of nudging and winking and sort of doing the pantomime. It's behind you. So as I say, that was my double experience of the gory Dracula.
Thanks, Juliette. And I'm sure you've got many questions for Juliette. So, and Juliette will be here for the rest of the day. We're going to have a 15-minute break there. Tea and coffee is free. Okay, so tea and coffee is and biscuits. R3, on behalf of, you've got to thank the Dracula Returns to Derby project for that. Please go and help yourself for a tea and coffee. We're going to start back again in 15 minutes, so we haven't got a lot of time. The one thing I want you to think about is creative writing. Copying, right? Copying is the condition of culture. And I think that's very much clear from Juliette's presentation. Copyright is how writers make money from their copying. So you've got to copy something and maybe change one thing and change it enough that you can get away with claiming copyright, right? And the whole of Dracula in Derby is a story of copyright, because Nosferatu, the film, Florence Stoker closed that down because it said it was an adaptation of Dracula and they hadn't got the copyright. So she closed that down, and Dracula on stage here was the first time it was legally licensed. Anyway, if you were going to adapt Dracula today, you can, because it's out of copyright. But you have to, if you want to adapt one of the vampires that Juliette's been talking about, you need to change it just enough so that it is out of copyright. We're going to come back. So that's your homework, is to think about how you are going to adapt and change something enough that you can exploit the copyright for it and be a wonderfully successful and famous writer like Jeremy Harte, who is our next speaker in 15 minutes. But let's have a break for some coffee. Okay, thank you. Okay, everybody. Please put your hands together to welcome Jeremy Harte of Bourne Hall Museum and the Folklore Society to talk to us today about the burning question, was Dracula an Irishman?
About Bram Stoker, there is little doubt. He was born in Dublin, his father a Dubliner, his mother a woman from Sligo. Stoker was an Irishman, and he was also the author of the most charismatic novel, drawing on... I'm happier standing. Drawing on the available technology of the 19th century, including the phonograph and other interesting technical devices for transmitting sound. Should we not put the two together? It's a little-known fact that Stoker was your man for the vampire novel. We're working on the forward? Should be, yeah. Oh, I love it when technical people can't do it either.
It was just working. It was.
Superlative. Look, you're a step ahead of me already, aren't you? So you'll have realised he anticipated a lot of the stuff that Juliette was talking about. Alternatively, it is possible that there may be something slightly dodgy about this picture. After spending more time than I really should have done online, I began to realise there was something entirely dodgy about Dracula's Irishness as well. But I can say that here safely because I am in Derby and I'm not likely to inconvenience the annual Dublin Dracula Fest, which takes place on the bank holiday Monday in October. And where you can go past the location where Stoker lived in Dublin. Went to Trinity in 1870 and was all set for a career until, with working with Henry Irving that we've heard about, he moved, like so many Irish people, to London in 1878. So work begins on Dracula in 1890. He joins the London Library and proceeds to deface books in a manner which you are not encouraged to do, which cheers up everybody who wants to actually follow his trail. We know exactly what he was reading, and surprisingly enough, it was about Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, the buses will each October pull up in front of that plaque, and the guide will explain to you that Stoker was, in fact, motivated by his deep knowledge of ancient Irish legend to pull out a story which is only superficially transferred to a different set of characters in a different part of the world completely. Because, let's face it, there was an Irish vampire tradition. And, you know, oh yeah, left shoulder, I'm beginning to get this. It's, you know, yeah. Yeah. Or even behind me back. So, no, it's all right, I'll do it. I've got the hang of it. As long as I'm pointing towards the computer, it'll work. So Sheridan Le Fanu was actually employing Stoker at the time when they were together a common interest in vampire novels. Therefore, you have a joint tradition of Irish horror. About half of Le Fanu's stuff does exploit an Irish setting. You've got a system here where narratives involving ancestral violence have a common interest to both men. On his mother's side, Stoker's family went back to the Blakes, tribe of Galway. The Blakes were out in 1798 and were actually involved in the Irish insurrection. In fact, his great-great-great-grandfather had the privilege of greasing his own hangman's noose so that it would slip nicely and throttle him rather than being uncomfortable in his last minutes. It's the sort of thing that does get passed down as a family tradition. And you can realise, therefore, or can you, that they would be concerned about exploiting the image of the vampire to talk about the Irish situation. In particular, you're recognising the Carmilla slide here, the unwisdom of allowing strangers to enter into your house, or in the case of the Irish, your country. For the family oppressed by the vampire, read The Irish Nation after Diarmaid MacMurrough inconveniently thought it would be a good idea to ask Strongbow and the English army to come and help him get his bid to be High King of Ireland. It is true, embarrassingly, that Carmilla is also not set in Ireland, it's set in Styria, but remember that Styria was a colony of Austria and Ireland was a colony of England. It is equally true, embarrassingly, that Dracula is not set in Ireland, but it is set in Wallachia, and what the hell? Wallachia was a colony of the Ottoman Empire. If you want to write a thesis, you can body this out a little bit more, of course, but you're getting the broad overall string of the narrative here. And you've also got to remember that vampires are bad. We're in the pre-boyfriend stage here. And that therefore, if you want to represent something bad, like England or Ireland or landlords or tenants or the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, depending on which newspaper you're working for, you draw it as a vampire. So here is young Ireland defending her country from the Brits. And this is a popular mode. This is in fact responding to a Punch cartoon, which is exactly the other way round, in which young Ireland is a vampire feasting on poor Hibernia and persuading her to go all radical. And this sort of thing was being published in a lot of Irish newspapers, including The Nation, which is you might suspect was a bit more on the Irish insurrectionary side, and which was actually closed down after it published an article advocated armed warfare against the English. The article was signed by a woman called Speranza. Very sensibly, being a woman, they couldn't prosecute her, so they just closed the magazine down to stop her writing anymore. And Speranza, in daily life, was Jane, soon to be Lady Jane Wilde, married a doctor called William Wilde, and proceeded in her subsequent career to write books on Irish folklore. Here is Speranza, in, I have to say, a comparatively subdued outfit. Normally she preferred to kind of wear oversized dresses with even larger shamrocks on to indicate her political views. And her earlier careers, 1840s to 70s, was based on passionate advocacy for Irish independence. William died in 1876, and in 1878 Jane moved to London. Bit of a pattern emerging here, and moved on to writing books on Irish folklore because she understood that they sold rather better on the London market. This is the London Library copy of her Ancient Charms, Mystic Legends and Spells of Ireland. So Jane is responsible for presenting us. This is 1888, so 2 years before Dracula, just at the time when Stoker is starting to get his act together, looking for narratives. He was friendly with the family, he dined with the Wildes, and Florence Stoker would have been Florence Wilde if she'd married Oscar Wilde. You will have gathered, by the way, as far as Jane is concerned, that a mother who calls her son Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wilde is trying to boost up the Irish connection a little bit more. Also, the fact that she called him Oscar Fingal, which are the two spellings of Irish names which are in fact taken from the Scottish fake Ossianic ballads of Macpherson, is not bilingual. This is actually quite an important point which we'll pick up on in a moment. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, and it contains a large body of Irish material which has been, reverting to Matt's earlier copied, plundered. It is well out of copyright, and you can do anything you like with it, including narratives such as The Horned Women, which is the one frequently now a good storyteller's legend, in which the good wife is sitting by the fire, hears a knocking, and in comes a woman with a horn on her head, who announces herself, "I am the witch of the one horn." Progressively, more witches enter, until the wife, who has been carding wool all by herself, has her house taken over by 12 mad horned women, with an increasing number of horns, who characterize woman and get us water. And while the woman is getting water in a sieve, because they are not particularly helpful witches, the spirit of the well announces to her that she's got to get them out of the house. She returns to follow instructions. She finds that in the absence of water, they have cut the throats of all her family and mixed the blood with some oatmeal to make a cake. And she gets them out of the house by the traditional Irish method of shouting, "The hill of the Fenian women is on fire." This is a local legend. It's based at Slievenamon in Tipperary, the Hill of the Women. She then stops them coming back in again by having bolted the door, having thrown out the footwater. Dirty water is a no-no in the house, and having crumbled a little bit of the blood cake and laid it between the lips of the sleeping people. The cake can no longer let them in miraculously. The bar cannot stir from the door, nor can the clean water act to open the door as the dirty water would unquestionably have done. Ah, you're thinking. That's what folklorists do. They go out into the countryside and they collect the old stories from the people in Tipperary. That's what John Dodd did in 1851 when he wrote the original version of this story, which appears without acknowledgement in Lady Wilde's book of 1888. So we have, I'm afraid, caught Jane out. And in fact, if you look at the rest of her book, the way in which the law is presented, and of course the thing is, at that point, she was the only person publishing any of this stuff. It wasn't until the serious Irish collecting started in the 1920s, including other versions of The Fairy Hill is on Fire, that they realized that she had actually been souping up a hell of a lot of it and injecting Gothic notes into stories which originally didn't have anything of the sort in them. She loves darkness, she loves shades, she loves wisps, she loves people speaking in low voices from beyond the grave. All of this is actually taken from Ossian, and none of it comes from the sources, the country people. What did come from the country people were the original manuscripts collected by Sir William Wilde, who has left a brilliant description of how he learned Irish as a boy, how he hung out with people as a country doctor, and how he recorded the material, who published virtually nothing, and who died in 1876, 1 year before the publication of The Horned Women in the Dublin magazine by his then widow. So, over to a serious folklorist, a chap called Jeremiah Curtin, who, despite being an American, learned perfectly good Irish and went collecting in Munster. And Curtin actually picks up a series of narratives which are much, much closer to the kind of thing that we find in Lady Wilde, but in an authentic Irish mode. Still involving blood, still involving the dead. But in this case, it's a girl who goes into a graveyard for a dare. The dead man wakes up, says, "Carry me on your back." And they walk past a house, and she kind of wonders what's going to happen, and he looks at it and goes, "Nope, can't go in there, they've thrown out the dirty water." Another house, the same. Another house, no clean water and only dirty. We are going to go in there. Lay me down, girl, and get me a razor and a bowl. And the dead man cuts the throats of the sleepers and takes a bowl and mixes it into the cake and makes a cake. And the cake then he feeds to himself and to the girl. But the girl prudently holds up her petticoat in front of her lips and lets the crumbs fall out of her mouth and catches them at the bottom of the petticoat. And then the dead man says, well, that was good. You'll have a bit of energy now after you've eaten. Take me back to the grave with you, my darling. And they make their way back up the hill, and the cock crows, and he says, it's a bastard cock. Carry on, my dear. And the second cock crows, and that's a bastard cock. And while they're going, he's conversationally telling her where his treasure is hidden. And just as he's getting in a sneering sort of way, he says, if you'd only stayed in the house and put a crumb of the blood cake between the lips of the sleeping people, they'll all have revived. But now, and at that moment, the third cock crows, and he falls in his grave muttering, damn, damn, damn. I could have taken you with me. So you realise this is actually the core narrative, which the Tipperary version has stitched with an entirely different story and stitched onto a fairy narrative. So yes, we do have a story about dead men. And yes, it's an Irish story. But the earliest version doesn't involve blood, because the earliest version is found in the 10th century, Ector Nera, which is the adventures of Nera, who, we are now back in the time of the Ulster heroic, the Connaught heroic cycle, because this is coming from Rathcruhan. This is the story of a night, a dark and demon-haunted night that no man dares go out in, and the heroes of the court of Connaught are sitting around the fire in Rathcruhan. And Ailill says, the man that would go out in this dark night and tie a withy around the neck of the hanged man, he would have this gold-hilted sword. And they look at the sword, and they look at the knight, and they look at the knight, and they look at the sword, and they're not having any of it until Nera says, I will do it. And he goes out, armed with a small piece of willow in his pocket, and he tries tying it round, and it springs off. And he tries tying it round the second time, and it springs off. And the hanged man looks down at him and says, you could be tying it till morning if you didn't put a peg in it, you know. So Nera puts a peg in, and it stays very nicely round the neck of the hanged man. And the hanged man says, well, you're a fella. Now, take me for a drink, because I was very thirsty when I was hanged. And of course, as in all of these stories, there is nothing that he can do but to take the dead man on his neck. And so he walks, and he goes past a house, and the man says, no, there is a wall of fire around that house, for that is a house where they have banked up the fire every evening and not let a spark glimmer. Take me on. And they go on a little bit, and the man says, no, there is a wall of water around that house, for that is a house in which there is no dirty water left after sunset. And they walk on, and the dead man says, that's the house with the dirty water in it. I can drink now. And he goes in, and Nera lets him down, and he drinks, and he takes one drop of the water and sprinkles it on the face of every person in the house, and they die. Because this is in the 10th century, where we don't have happy endings. So see, alas, the pre-blood. I mean, blood is wonderful stuff to think with. I mean, you can't have a story without a bit of blood in it. We're on the edges of vampirism. We're also, alas, in a narrative which wasn't published until about 1910 by Kuno Meyer, so it's well out of the range for a possible Dracula source. What I love about a lot of the literature which you read on this is it starts off with Stoker as an Irishman. It then proceeds to the fact that there is an Irish tradition which involves stories like the Horned Woman or the Man in the Graveyard or Nera. And it then proceeds to go, and he would have known it, like he would have absorbed it by a form of osmosis, by walking around the streets of Dublin. You know, he'd have come home full of the crack. The appalling possibility that folktales were a minority interest in 1870s, 80s Dublin, and that he wouldn't have known any of this stuff is never actually admitted. Because what you have got when you're looking at this material, particularly the last years of the 19th century, after folklore becomes popular, before serious folklore collecting becomes a thing, is that you've got the mediation of traditional or folk narrative through the way that people want to understand it, which mysteriously turns out to be exactly the way that people want to know all about it on the web these days. There's been this wonderful jump from 1900 to 2020, which totally bypasses 120 years of folklore scholarship, because it's out of copyright. So you get the Lennon-she. They stopped spelling she that way in Irish in 1947, but this information has not come through to certain quarters. It's a useful footprint if you ever want to check out whether somebody's using out-of-date sources online. So there she is. Lennon is basically lover. So she, of course, is a fairy elf. This is the lover of the fairy realm. And the reason why she is the seducer, lover, and destroyer of artists and poets, is because Jane Wilde thought she was. In fact, Jane Wilde announces that there is the Lennon-she who is the good fairy, and there is a Ban-she who is the bad fairy. Ban, of course, means woman, so you notice that Jane was trying to play games with the Irish yet again. It is possible that she just wanted a contrast between life and death, and the advantage from her point of view is that having dismissed the Ban-she, who is already starting on her career as an Irish icon, rather than a specific set of family traditions, is precisely because Jane wants to have a figure who, by her songs, will inspire poets and men to deeds of valour. In other words, writing about insurrectionary armed uprising in the nation, just like Speranza. So what gets lost in all of this is the fact that Lennon is a gender-ambiguous word and basically refers, as lover does, to a person of either sex. So men are going to have a fairy mistress, Lennon. Women are going to have a fairy lover, Lennon. Both of them could be inconvenient. There's a bizarre subset of narratives perfected by William Carlton, who was bilingual, but who was also a convert from Catholicism to Protestantism, who tells this wonderful story about a woman afflicted, and it's never quite clear, again, in the best tradition of horror, whether it's real or imaginary, by Lennon Llian Suggath, the fairy lover of the priest. Because it turns out this woman has been a priest's mistress. And I'm kind of going, yeah, that's a really bad thing in Catholicism, but you're a Protestant, you're supposed to be telling these people to get married. However, he had issues with belonging to both religions, and he exploited it, as people do, through the medium of horror and the fairy realm. What you get, once the Lennon-she is picked up and becomes a trope in secondary folklore writing, is the Lennon-she as muse. And Yeats in Celtic Twilight, Yeats was a folklorist. Yeats talked directly to people, and some of his direct analysis is probably the best material come out of 19th century folkloristics in Ireland. On the other hand, when he was in full-on poetic mode, he worked on the principle that since he too could communicate directly with fairies as a member of the Golden Dawn, what he said had just as much value as what a bunch of peasants said. So when Yeats is in his kind of poetic, prophetic persona, he knows exactly who the Lennon-she is. She is the lover of those who die young, and she creates poetic inspiration. And you're kind of going, this is all sounding terribly romantic. Totally, and not entirely in contrast, because the romantic cliché is already picking up on a series of, uncertainties about male-female relationships. So that you have got stories in which there are supernatural female figures whom it is bad to know. Transferring to the other Gallic culture, this is the Barvan-she. This is the Gallic spelling of she. For some bizarre reason, the plural name appears in the red lettering, and you've got a singular lady on the left-hand side, which may mean that somebody didn't know what they were talking about. I did get it as a nice slide online, though, and she is one of those figures who, is extremely dangerous to know and who assails lonely hunters going out away from society into the wilderness. So you've got the woman and the wilderness and danger and blood, because these are the figures who accost young men. Interestingly, there's a double set of Highland stories, one beginning with with a version of the Horned Women, which explains the whole beginning of the story, which the Irish one doesn't. So it must be an older analogue, in which the reason why the women come into the house at all is because the good wife of the house has said, oh, if only somebody would help me with all of this spinning, never wish for anything, especially when you're alone in the house after dark, and say it aloud, because you will inevitably be granted it in a way that you don't like. As were the 4 young men who, in a shealing, this is bedding down in the Highlands away from the village up in the hills, say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we had a little female company? And female company arrives and dances with them. Isn't that nice? 3 of the lads dancing, and the 4th lad providing mouth music, because he had to do the dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, because they haven't brought any instruments with them. So while he's going dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, his future dance partner is looking at him, and it suddenly occurs to him he doesn't really like the look in her eyes. Of course, being a Highland hunter, he has his dirk on him, and when she asks if she can have a piece of snuff, by way of building up a relationship between the two of them, he helpfully puts a little patch of snuff on the end of his knife and holds it out to her with the point facing her. She takes the hint and hovers at a distance from him from the rest of the evening. We've all been on dates like that. And then you've got, as he looks over to the corner of the room, a thin trickle of blood making its way towards him, because his other three companions have all had their throats cut, and the beaver and she are feasting on their blood. So the flow of fluids in a relationship between the two sexes may or may not be meaningful. I couldn't possibly comment. But you've also got these, and of course there are analogues the other way around, where the sexual relationship is the other way. These things are part of the profound suspicion which you get in a traditional gender-divided society about relationships. The split between wild and home and the split between men and women is like a classic. I have to say that none of this stuff is really filtering through to the makers of popular drawing books, in which the Glasstick, another character who occupies the same narrative space as the beef she can be told by her deer hooves, but she doesn't in the original stories have anything like this level of design sense. We've already had, of course, the Empusa, who again could be told by the animal legs at the bottom of a woman's body. Marina Warner had a whale of a time writing about this sort of thing. The only difficulty, of course, reverting to our original inspiration by Irish Gaelic storytelling, is that all of this stuff was basically published after 1890. Bang goes the connection with Dracula. So what we're looking for, if we are desperately trying to entertain those people on a bus in October in Dublin, is, can we get the connection with Stoker? Here's your man, colorized. Here's Trinity Library. If you read the sort of things I've been reading, not normally based in contemporary sources, it was while he was flicking through the pages of ancient manuscripts in that library that he discovered the clue that would lead to Dracula. Or one of them, here it is. The main narrative is from a vampire game, it's from a zombie game, because I had a lot of difficulty finding a 16th century Irish zombie picture. However, the volumes in the middle, this is actually a post-Stoker edition, but there's an 1857 translation, is Keating's Forrest Fasser and Erin, The Foundations of the Knowledge of Ireland, or The History of Ireland, as it's usually rendered. And buried in the early stages, you've got to remember that Keating was the heir of a long, long Irish tradition of explaining that, unlike, Johnny by Knightley's, like the Romans and the Greeks, the Irish did actually have a tradition going back to about 1900 BC. All of it suitably chronicled, and all of it containing the various peoples who have invaded Ireland, the last of whom are the present Irish, the Milesians, who superseded the Tuatha De Danann. And the Tuatha then continue to exist in Irish narrative as the fairy folk, as the Sidhe, living in the Sidhe, the fairy mounds. However, in their earlier stage, before the Feast of Godnew, where they all actually take on immortality, they're just a human tribe like everyone else, but with immensely powerful druids. Everybody has druids in these stories. Even the Greeks have druids. So there they are, helping out. They're in Greece at this time. Ireland connects with the classical world in these narratives, and they're mates with the Athenians. The Athenians are being invaded by the Syrians. And the Syrians are well pissed off, because every time a Syrian warrior dies in battle, they find him battling against them the next day on the Athenian side. And they kind of figure that there's something a bit weird about this. It may even be supernatural. So they go and have a word with their druid. The Syrians also have druids, who explains that these figures whom you think are fighting for the Athenians are in fact dead men reanimated by demons. Okay, said the Syrians, but that's very good to know. What do we do about it? Well, if they're dead men, he says, there is a simple way. You need to overpower the demon that occupies them. So take a stick of rowan wood, and instead of thrusting weapons at them, impale them on a rowan wood stake as they lumber towards you, and they will disappear into worms if they are true dead people, because you will have exorcised the demon. And they do this, and the ranks of the Athenians thin out remarkably, and eventually the Tuatha De Danann have to leave for Ireland because their former allies get fed up with them. So, Irish vampire and zombie in one single narrative. Or is it? Because we're moving back here to some of the earlier material that we heard from Juliette in Walter Map, where what looks like a dead person walking is in fact, and this is the theological version, I mean, quite clearly, the native peoples of Northern Europe thought that these dead people were dead people who got up out of their graves. And a lot of very highly played clerics spent a lot of their time explaining this as complete nonsense. They are, in fact, dead bodies that a demon has got into. It's a little bit like a glove puppet, only not quite so friendly. And of course, this is why zombies lurch. The demon is having a lot of difficulties finding out the bits that you pull to make the arms and the legs work. And if you overpower the demon, you have exorcised the walking thing. Now, it is true that this narrative was available. It is also true that we have no copy of Keating, which has been annotated in Stoker's hand, or any reason to believe he ever knew of it. It is also embarrassingly true that on the one occasion that Stoker actually wrote an Irish horror novel, The Snake's Path, which is set in Clare, he incorporated no vampires, virtually no legendary material, and regrettably no sub-narrative about colonialism. On the other hand, there's always language, because frequently it has been claimed that in his deep researches in Trinity Library, Stoker was able to access a lot of material that told him about vampires, including all the Irish words for vampire, which we'll have a quick run through. Niavmarv, undead. Definitely, it is a privation of Varv, which is dead. Unfortunately, it also happens to be a word which appears for the first time in the 1933 Irish translation of Dracula. So we can probably rule that one out. We do get another redhead for our money, though. Jevon Fuller, demon of blood. Yes, there is no doubt that actually says demon of blood. It has also, as you will see, inspired at least one Irish heavy metal album cover. It also turns out, when you consult the dictionaries, to have been coined in 1941 in a horror story by the brother of Flann O'Brien. Still no Stoker. Now, this is the one that you always hear on the bus tours. Droch Ola. Ola is the lenitive genitive of full blood. So Droch is bad. That's great. And quite clearly this is the origin of Dracula. The fact that Stoker actually underlined the word Dracula in a history of Wallachian folklore, and is nothing to do with the fact that you can find an Irish pair of words that sounds vaguely like it. The only problem is, unfortunately, it's not good Irish. Bad of blood is not a very convincing name, or even of bad blood is not a very convincing name either. On the other hand, it impresses people on bus tours. Now we're talking. Yes, the Diarg Dua, who may possibly be the Diarg Dul, who could conceivably be the Diarg Du, or could be the Diarg Julie. Nobody quite knows what it means. This is due to the fact that Diarg Du doesn't mean anything. I have seen it done as thirst for blood, but there is no word for thirst that sounds anything like Dua in my dictionaries. Nevertheless, there is a story about the Diarg Dua, and there she is, a girl from Waterford, who was married against her will to a brutal elderly man who beat her up so badly that eventually she declined into the grave out of sheer unhappiness, and came back irritably the next night, first kissing her father, who had insisted on being married off to this wealthy guy, and then meeting her lover in the lane and sucking the blood out of him. Female assertion, went back to the grave, after that, having got a taste for this sort of thing, returned and became a vampire in the Waterford area and had to be buried under a massive pile of stones. I'm going to try and go, this is the authentic voice of Irish folklore. This is what we will find if we go to Strongbow's Oak, under which she was buried. There is no Strongbow's Oak. In a 1914 vampirism volume, there is a narrative rather more briefly going, a beautiful vampire is buried under Strongbow's Tower. And in a rare moment of research, Montague Summers, the demonologist and vampire hunter, went to Waterford only to find out there's no Strongbow's Tower either. You will begin to gather that the Diarg Dua is not, necessarily coming out of this very well. In fact, once you start, undermining a little bit of this in the dictionaries, you discover that the phrase Diarg something, Diarg Deal is probably the most authentic version, refers not to a vampire, but to a small black insect. which doesn't even come from the grave and feed on other insects. I'm sorry about that. But which did have a name originally, Dievdal, which is basically water beetle, which then got transferred to the ugliest beetle they could find, still called jarog, with a bit of folk etymology, even though it isn't red. Jarog means red, it does not mean blood. You cannot use it to mean blood in any Irish idiom. Which did have give a dog a bad name and hang him, up there with the wren and the viper, that well-known Irish inhabitant, as being the three evil creatures. So that's where your vampire comes from. You're going to want a genuine legend now, aren't you? I mean, I'm being unfair to you, I'm teasing you. Here is Patrick Joyce. He is a proper chap, busily doing his research for Irish names of places and making his way westwards from Garva, looking insistently, because he's writing a place name book, splendid chap, for the place called Sleshlaverne. And they take him there. And he goes, what's the story about? So the story, in fact, is recorded early, because the Ordnance Survey, in between doing wicked colonial things like finding maps that people could actually, trace land boundaries and get their way around, also wickedly colonially recorded an awful lot of Irish folklore so that they could get the spellings right. And they set down the story of Slecht Avity. Arvatach was an enchanter who was killed by Finn McCool. Generally speaking, hero versus enchanter is one of these standard things in Irish legends. Or possibly he was a dwarf who belonged to the enchanter and who was killed. Or he may have been a dwarf who was an enchanter, whatever. There's a guy called Arvati, or called Avak is dwarf, who was slain by a hero and buried under a large pile of stones. Which you can still go and see in Slecht Avity Township to this very day. But then he popped up again. And then they buried him a second time, and up he came. And after that, they realized that they were, what was it? Yes, the definition of stupidity is repeating the same action and waiting for a different outcome. So this time they buried him upside down, and as far as anybody knows, he's heading down in the wrong way and is still doing so. End of legend. Large stones placed over him in the narrative, because that was how to stop him coming up again in the landscape reality, because this is the Neolithic monument that they fastened the legend to. And you're kind of going, yeah, it's an Irish legend. Where's the blood? I'll give you blood. Arvatach has become the Irish vampire, and if you search for him, you will have an awful lot of success. Because in 1997, Peter Haining and Peter Beresford-Ellis, significantly Beresford-Ellis, who is a Celticist, chose on this particular occasion to write under the name Peter Tremaine, which he otherwise used for writing fiction. And I think that gives us a bit of a heavy hint that he wasn't too happy about the scholarly credentials of what he was publishing, wrote a book on vampires. And here, for the first time, the true legend of Arvatach was revealed to the world. Incidentally, if we're on the Stoker trail, I should point out to my considerable embarrassment that even the Patrick Joyce version was published in 1910, i.e. 13 years too late to have influenced Dracula, but we've left all of that behind now. What we're talking about now is the Irishness that is beyond place and time that just influenced him on the wind. He must have heard about this story. And the story which he must have heard about is the story written in 1997, which is the one where they announce not only that Arvatach was a tyrant, he's left his dwarfishness behind him, because that's not quite what we need, but that he was stabbed with a spear of yew wood, and then they sprinkled rowan twigs on his grave to stop him coming up again. Well, I think you can see what's happening here is that the quasi-vampire tradition from Keating has been grafted by people who've been doing a bit of research onto the narrative from County Derry. But that's not all. In 2000, Bob Curran writes the article from which I think it's short enough to be legitimate. Filched Was Dracula an Irishman as a title, and explains more things. It's a fascinating article because it produces more Irish vampires than you can shake a stick at, with no actual documentation for any of them, except one of them which is said to have come from a talk given by the great folklorist of the Irish Folklore Commission, Sean O'Sullivan, in 1961, according to what somebody remembered in 2000. And here's a bit of homework. In 2064, I want everyone in this room, without having taken any notes, to remember exactly what I said. Thank you. 40 years can do things to people's memories, and by the time some of this material had been filtered through Curran's own susceptibility, Curran, I have to say, I have every sympathy for commercial writers of folklore books, but I am aware more than most that they are subject to temptations to tinker with the stories. Improves the narrative enormously by having Arvatoch comes out of the grave and requires to drink a bowl of blood every night, rather than merely feasting in a possibly metaphorical way on the blood of his former subjects. Moreover, the druid, or a saint, Curran leaves our options open because he'd like to throw a few Irish saints into this mix, says, he is not as you think. Arvatoch is one of the Niamh Marv. He is a Diarg Dúli. At which point everybody goes, as opposed to going, hang on, I thought this was a legend allegedly happening in the 10th century and recorded in 1910, and you're using 3 words that weren't made up until about the 1950s. No, so there we have got a story which introduces the appropriate element. And of course, what you've got, you look at the artwork which is accompanying this. The druid proceeds to give the instructions that the spear must crush him. Thorns, rather than rowan, are sprinkled on his grave, which I think is actually an introduction from Eastern European vampire lore. But, heck, one moorland tree is as good as another for these purposes. But he is also a prince. So he's edging closer and closer towards the Dracula model. We no longer have a bad-tempered upside-down dwarf. Instead, we have an undead king who is feasting on the blood of his subjects posthumously. And you're asking yourself, what's driving this? This is an area where I need to go carefully because, firstly, my job, qua folklorist, is to actually have some feeling for where people are coming from and going to, as opposed to jumping up and down telling them they're a bunch of sillies who've got it all wrong. Although you will notice there has been an element of that as well. But if you are attempting to project Irish lore, and colonialism isn't, I think, really the right word here, because while Dracula is admittedly written in London, Dracula is an international possession. Nobody's going to actually quote Dracula as being a specifically British English novel. I wouldn't have said that any of the franchise is like screaming UK at anybody. What you're looking at instead is a desire to take what may be perceived from an Irish perspective as a sort of chip on your shoulder minority culture, albeit a minority culture is like, the best early medieval literature in Europe, but, we're going to skip that for the moment. We're just going to go, we're not up there with the big hitters. The way of doing that, of course, is to announce that Dracula was really an Irishman, that what might look like a piece of global culture is actually a piece of Irish culture which has been translated to the wider stage of the world. And therefore, you're able to, go back and assert your own culture, because we're going back to a stone monument in County Derry, but you're also able to announce that everything that people think of, is really our stuff. This is, there's almost like a cut-off point for countries. If you're amongst the very few countries that actually have some kind of internet presence as big nations, nobody bothers about where your folklore comes from or any of your other traditions. If you're lower down the pecking order, people like Nikola Tesla are jumped up and, have become iconic simply because they can progress as a national figure for people who don't feel everybody's heard of them, whereas everybody's heard of Tesla. It works in all of these fields just as much as it does in folklore. And so what happens, of course, is the shape, in fact, the very words of native Irish tradition have been modified until they produce undead and bloodsucker. And the image of the Irish vampire, stroke Arvatoch, has been modified precisely so that at the end of it, you're going to end up with a character who looks like a vampire ought to. In other words, like Samuel Beckett, who was really Nosferatu. Not many people know that. Thank you very much.
Just stay on the stage for a second, Jeremy.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. And would you please put your hands together in appreciation again of Mr. Jeremy Harte there. Now, Jeremy is an author, and I urge you all to search for him now on your phone so you don't forget Jeremy Harte and look at the books he's publishing. You're publishing a rate of about one a year at the moment, Jeremy, aren't you? Yes, yes. Also, Jeremy, as Juliette and I think Gail-Nina are members of the Folklore Society, Jeremy convenes the legendary weekends, which happen every year in the last weekend of... First weekend of September. And essentially, Jeremy picks a place which is fun to go to, has legends associated with, gets people together for 2 days, folklorists, storytellers, artists, people, etc. And I urge you to have a look at them. They're enormously good fun. So I have given Jeremy some copies of FLS News. So if you're interested in the Folklore Society, this is well, it's a sort of notes and queries. It's a sort of newsletter full of interesting things. Jeremy has a number of them to give away. All you have to do is ask him a question about the Folklore Society and legendary weekends in the lunch break, and he will do so. So, yeah, once again, thanks, Jeremy. We're going to have about... we're not going to break yet. What I would like to say is what Jeremy's picked out there, I think, is... in terms of us in Derby, is that Dracula is a huge creature of value, and that people are interested in them, him, them, her as well. People are interested in Dracula, so much so that they have bent Irish folklore to their service in service of tourism. That's why our project here in Derby has got funded. Because people are aware that if we can shape an offering in Derby, and that's through events such as this, and also driving people to where Dracula was first performed, the Grand Theatre, to the Hippodrome where Bela Lugosi performed, to the materials on offer at Derby museums, to any other sorts of things, we have a chance of getting on, and there really is an international Dracula tourist network. Not network, what's the right word? Trail. People go to Dublin. People go to Transylvania. There's not much there to see for Dracula.
Very pissed off Transylvania.
Yes, yes. Yes. And people, of course, go to Whitby. And Whitby is the place where Dracula lands in the novel. In the play in Derby, they get rid of Whitby. Dracula's already in London. So I think that a talk is a brilliant indication of the potential we have here in Derby to embrace Dracula, because it was only going to mean good things, I think, for the city. So I thought that was a good. So on that, you'll see over there, Dracula Returns to Derby. Dan is this is Dan and I's project. Dan would happily tell you about the stuff there, and we've got questions. We'd really love you to engage with the project, take stuff away about it, because we'll get more funding for that. And on that, if you've got the clicker here, on that, during the break, we're going to have a slightly longer break. We'd love you to complete this survey. So if I'll put this up in a moment, but if you use that with your cameras, it will take you to a survey. And if you can't use it with your cameras, then you can email dracula@derby.ac.uk, and Dracula will tell you where to find the survey. And that's helping us getting some info so that we can appeal for further funding, movement in this project. Okay. And so we're going to, let's just have a look at the timings here. So what time is it now? 12, good. So we've got quarter of an hour before refreshments. So we've got some time for reflection and writing. Jeremy will answer, I think, questions over lunch, over refreshments with Juliette and Gail-Nina. But I'm just going to invite Alexandra to the stage. Alexandra's a novelist, and she's going to give some impressions of maybe the day and maybe give you some creative prompts. Is that okay, Alex? Okay. Let's go, Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy. Hello, good afternoon. So I thought we'd use it as an opportunity to be enthusiastically inspired by everything that we're being taught today, everything we've learned about vampires, and particularly Dracula's origins in Derby. So if you want to use this to inform your creative work over the next couple of weeks, unfortunately we won't have a huge amount of time today to share, but if you did want to share your stories with Dracula, you can email Dracula himself, and that's dracula@derby.ac.uk. So for myself in particular, I thought it'd be curious if a vampire attended the event today. And how would they feel about that? How does it feel to have your family history spoken about so publicly? Do they want it corrected? Do they want to change the narrative? How do they feel about 2024? How would a vampire deal with Tinder or contemporary dating, for example? So if you want to reflect on these ideas, have a write during the break. We've got about 15 minutes, and then we'll have some teas and coffees. And we'd love to see what you share. So if you do want to send it through to Dracula, please do so. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. And so not only do we have Alex here, but we also have 3 expert writers in the audience from BA Creative Writing and Publishing. Would you put your hands up, please? There they are at the back. They have been thinking about all sorts of things going on. They've been drawing inspiration from Juliette's talk. They have been considering Jeremy's presentation of Irish folklore, and they have their own ideas. So please talk to them and ask them about the vampires that they have been creating in their heads. Or don't ask them. Or no, do ask them. I'm just teasing. And so let's break now for, I think we'll have Gail-Nina on at 1:30, so a little time to have a cup of coffee, talk to the speakers, who will be circulating along with our creative writers. Please engage with our project materials and resources. Remember, Jeremy has copies of FLS News. Remember, Dan is a font of wisdom about Dracula, and also all the events and stuff that we're going on. Dan, if people do want to get sandwiches, where can they go? But remember that tea and coffee is free, along with all the biscuits and material there. Yes, and there is gluten-free over there. And that is all for me to do now, apart from to ask you all to give Mr. Jeremy Harte a round of applause. Thanks.
Well, my name is Gail-Nina, and I am an art historian, which means that with me, you just have to look at the pictures. Very simple and very straightforward. You will see some pictures you've seen already, but I am following a visual trail concerned with Dracula and with vampires in general. And is this going to work? No? We've fixed this about 6 times already. Here you go. Well, what we're going to see is the visual trail detaching itself from the folklore trail via mostly literature and movies, but ending up in the realms of zoology. That's a squid. I like squid. This is the vampire squid from hell. That's what its Latin name translates as. Obviously, this is a fairly recent piece of nomenclature because, well, how long ago would you have called a squid a vampire squid? It doesn't suck blood. It's not particularly predatory, but it's got a kind of sheath, which is black inside and comes out like a hood or cape. Therefore, it's the vampire squid. The cape makes the vampire. Yes. It does not feed on blood, it says very clearly here. So, well, how do you recognize a vampire? It's interesting because if you'd asked that in the 17th century, in the remoter areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you would have had peasants saying, well, you recognized him because you buried him last week and he's reappeared. And he's looking healthier than he did when he was alive. Now you might say you recognize him because he's got a cape, preferably black lined with red. So we've got a huge gap here between the original belief and, well, what we have via the movies. I put this as evidence. This is a cutting from the Fortean Times. Nosferatu, or rather Nutsferatu. It's about a man who was attacked in a cinema by a squirrel, which attempted to bite him. But what I find funny is that Hunt Emerson has illustrated this story with a squirrel in a cape. How do you know it was a vampire squirrel? It was wearing a cape. Of course it wasn't. This is, in some ways, the face of Dracula. It's Bram Stoker, Irish but London-based, much influenced by a stay in Whitby, never went to Transylvania or Romania, and he looks like, you know, a nicely dressed Victorian gentleman. So we've got to factor that into it as well, that when he is writing, he's obviously not writing about squids and squirrels, he's not writing about scruffy peasants either, he's not necessarily writing about blood-red cloak linings. He is writing about a world where people dress in a formal manner. And this is his great mentor, if you like, Henry Irving, the actor. It's difficult to describe Bram Stoker's job, but Henry Irving's personal assistant is about the closest I can get to it. Someone described him to me as a theatre manager under the mistaken belief that Bram Stoker sat in the box office and took the tickets, which isn't quite what happened. But it's interesting because if we look at the image of Stoker, we're looking at someone, well, he could be anything. He could be a doctor, for example. If we look at the image of Irving, can you start to see a bit of drama coming in there? Now, Irving was an actor. Stoker adored Irving. Irving was charismatic, he was hypnotic, and he played around the edges of the gentlemanly. He played roles like Mephistopheles. He did not play Dracula, but he played Mephistopheles. And so that's coming in as well. And that's not coming from a literary source. That's coming from this bloke I work with, Henry Irving, the greatest actor of his generation, and he's got a piercing eye. So you're allowing yourself to have a respectable Victorian world within which there's the rather mysterious element. And this is the piercing eye in action. I don't have a photograph of Henry Irving doing it, so here's Bela Lugosi in the film of Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, despite the fact that he is only hypnotizing Lou here in this image, you can see that one reason Lou Costello has fallen under the vampire's spell is because Lugosi's wearing a cape. This is the important thing. We've got the visual signifier. Lugosi was apparently buried in one of his vampire capes. Oops. Yes, so what would our folklore vampire look like? He has no particular face, he has no particular costume at all. He looks like whoever it was who died, but you're pretty sure is not resting in their grave. I've put this up. This is Edward Cullen as Robert Pattinson, or Robert Pattinson as Edward Cullen. I never remember which way around it is, from Stephanie Meyer's Twilight. It's actually a small plastic figure. And he looks more or less like the boy next door. So if it happened to be a young man, he might look like this. But usually it's your old Uncle Fred. who died after a disreputable life, and people have seen him around. And how do you know he's become a vampire? Well, people around him are getting ill. That's a good sign. So you go dig up his body, and the giveaway sign is he doesn't look the way he should. He looks bloated, and he's maybe swimming in red liquor in the coffin, and his cheeks are very red. These are all natural processes of decomposition. But in the more distant villages of places like Serbia or the Greek islands, you don't necessarily have that knowledge. So whereas poor old Uncle Fred is quietly decomposing, people say, look, he's been feeding on blood, that's why everyone gets ill. So if you actually want an image of the original vampire, you can either have a partially decomposed corpse, or you can have Uncle Fred shuffling around in whatever he was buried in, which is probably not going to be a satin-lined cape at all. It will probably be either a shroud or some pretty ordinary clothing. Another aspect of the visualization of the vampire comes from the bat. There are bats that suck blood. There is a vampire bat. The bat is named after the superstition, not the other way around. It lives in South America. It's called Desmodus rotundus, which I always think of as little fat Desmond. And it's not very big. It's pretty damn small. The actual body part of the vampire bat is about the size of a mouse. But it's got scary teeth. And when you get a lot of them together, it looks really fair, really spooky. And yeah, this gives you some idea. It really isn't a very big thing. It will not necessarily attack humans. It's just as happy to attack horses and cattle. But it does drink blood. And so naturally, like the squid because it's got a cape, the bat because it drinks blood, we have the word vampire attached to it. We do also have a visual tradition just of evil things. A Christian tradition, which isn't specifically about vampires. It comes in areas where the vampire tradition was not known, but it is the Christian tradition of devils and demons. And in perfectly straightforward mainstream Christian art, these are frequently shown as horrible hybrids, more or less human in shape, but sometimes with bat wings, because you're not going to give them angel wings, are you? You don't get devils with swan wings. So this is a part of an image from the baptistry in Florence, and it shows bat-winged demons. So we've got quite a lot of possibilities here, but we've got to move from our Uncle Fred decaying through to our Dracula's silk cape via the media. And, the media starts when Western Europe picks up on the vampire belief and starts initially to write stories and poems and then to put the ideas on film and on stage. This is John Polidori. He was the uncle of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the pre-Raphaelite, but they never met. Polidori was a very young doctor who travelled to Europe with Lord Byron. Quite what the relationship is has been hotly contended. But I think, looking at this, Polidori was a Byron wannabe. He was a good-looking man. He was quite short, but he clearly wanted that dramatic, Byronic look. Byron was the darling and the demon of Europe. He could seduce any woman. He was hypnotic. And he wrote poetry, which was handy. And he possibly had an affair with his half-sister. I mean, it gets better and better. Perfect. I think that little Polidori was a wannabe and didn't really make it. Oops, come on. And that's Byron. Now, we have Byron and Polidori and Shelley and Mary Shelley on holiday, as it were, in Geneva. And you all know it was the year of no summer, and they were bored and they decided to write ghost stories, and Mary Shelley wrote what was the original form, the pattern of Frankenstein. We're not sure who else wrote what, but we do know Byron started a story, typical of Byron, he didn't finish it. Byron had been traveling in Greece. He would have known about Greek superstitions. He wrote a short story about a vampire. And when you read Byron's short story, it sounds a bit as if it's about him, because his vampire is not Uncle Fred in his dirty grave clothes. His vampire is an aristocrat who is very seductive to women and also deadly to them. But Byron never finished this story. Polidori, the wannabe, picks it up and finishes it. And later on it's published, and it's published as if it was by Lord Byron. The story is just called A Vampire, and it became a big hit. Polidori said he never intended it to be published. He'd sent a copy to a friend, blah-de-blah-de-blah. But it was published as though by Lord Byron, and everyone thought this is Byron revealing his vampiric self. It was Polidori revealing his wannabe Byron self, would be slightly more accurate. But The Vampire actually sets the pattern long before Dracula. It was first published in the New Monthly Magazine in 1819. It sets the pattern for the vampire who isn't someone recently dead. It's someone who's managed to survive. They have been a vampire for a long time, so they know the game. And they are aristocratic, and they are good looking, and they can move in, not just in society, but in polite society, not the peasants, but in an evening event. And this pattern really is coming via the Byron-Polidori connection. And therefore, we start to get a different kind of vampire, the aristocratic, long-lived vampire, who, of course, is ultimately the model for Stoker's Count Dracula, with a little bit of Henry Irving thrown in. The Vampire was highly popular across Europe, the short story. It was dramatized by 1820. There were at least 5 different stage versions of The Vampire. At this period, if you went to the theatre, you would get a programme of different events. So to have a short drama in with other things was quite common. I happen to like, this is one of the very few of the early dramatizations that we have an illustration for. The illustration is by Cruikshank. And the story goes that in this stage version, they had some costumes left over from Macbeth. So suddenly the vampire became a Scottish laird and everyone was turning up in kilts. This did not start a fashion for specifically Scottish vampires. It was, I think, just to do with stagecraft. Whoops. But this is from the same production. The lady's got a tartan stole on, but we can see that even though the vampire is clearly wearing a kilt, he's got a cape. He can make that bat-like gesture. It doesn't matter so much on the written page, but the minute it's on the stage in front of you, whoa, you're doing the Dracula. So the cape, or in this case, perhaps it's a blanket, some kind of drapery, some kind of revelation and hiding becomes hugely important. And we're starting to develop a different way of looking at the vampire, a different kind of danger. This is not Uncle Fred shuffling around. This is the stranger who you might invite into your bedroom. We do have another literary prototype for Dracula, which is Varney the Vampire. It was a penny dreadful. It was published in short bursts, as it were, in the 1840s, but they were gathered together into an immensely long and incredibly boring book. You can buy a reprint of it. And we're not quite sure who it was by. There are different theories whether it was who it was by. Reimer is one of them. But in this, we have, again, an aristocratic vampire from the past who is living on and on and on and on and on. And finally, the author or authors got fed up and had Varney throwing himself into the mouth of Mount Vesuvius when it was about to erupt, which is a fairly spectacular way of getting rid of anything, I would have thought. But again, it's the long-lived vampire. Yes, 1845 to 47. And he is Sir Francis Varney. By this time, the vampire is around, mostly turning up in short pieces of fiction and in poems or as a metaphor. You know, anything that sucks blood, like, as was mentioned, a landlord could be a vampire. Sheridan Le Fanu, the Irish author, produces not the first, but one of the first narratives about a female vampire, Carmilla, So it has obvious lesbian undertones. I remember the editor, Basil Copper, writing about this story, and I couldn't make any sense of what he'd written until the penny dropped that in Carmilla, there is a narrator who is the victim, who is telling the story of the vampiric Carmilla. And dear old Basil Copper had assumed that the narrator had to be male because they fall for Carmilla. Or it's very subtly done, I hasten to add, but no, it is girl-on-girl action. And as has been said, we now get the image of the female vampire, and she is almost always beautiful. She doesn't go back to the scruffy peasant woman of whom there were some. She becomes the equivalent of the aristocratic, long-lived male vampire. And there she is in a painting by, not by Edward Burne-Jones, the pre-Raphaelite, but his son, Philip Burne-Jones. And I don't think anyone knows where this painting has ended up, which is a great shame because we could all go and see it. And it was written in conjunction with Philip Burne-Jones' cousin, Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the poem The Vampire. And they are just about a seductive, destructive woman. Apparently it was Mrs. Patrick Campbell, the actress. But we get the seductive vampire turning up as part of the fin de siècle symbolist language of seduction, innocence, and death. That's a French one. And we also get the vampire as metaphor. It's interesting in this, which is by the socialist artist Walter Crane, we've got British Labour is the poor man worn out, being preyed upon by the vampire of capitalism, religious hypocrisy and party politics. And socialism is, of course, the guardian angel who will save him. But the vampire is definitely a bat. Crane, by this time you've got an option as to how you show the vampire, and Crane has gone visually for the bat. The metaphor, the vampire of capitalism, of course, actually comes from the writings of Karl Marx. But when Stoker is writing Dracula, he is writing at a period and in a context where, in fact, there are several significant narratives being produced in a fairly short time. We have Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, and we have Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is the first version of it, 1886, by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this one is important because it is, again, very much about visualization. Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde was made into a play, hugely popular, came across to Britain with an American actor, Richard Mansfield, and played at the Lyceum, in other words, Henry Irving's theatre, Bram Stoker's theatre. And it was, people absolutely adored it. Mansfield would transform before their very eyes from, actually, he was very clever. He transformed from Hyde to Jekyll, which is easier than doing it the other way around. I don't know, presumably there was some special effects, but it was mostly just posture and acting. The demon inside all of us. Hyde is not a vampire, but we're dealing with quite a lot of that imagery. This is a cabinet photograph of the actor Mansfield, and you can see he's Hyde down there and he's Jekyll up there. This was such a terrifying performance that the theatre stopped producing it during the Jack the Ripper murders because it was bad taste, I guess, although there isn't anything quite like that in the story. But also some people reported to the police, could this actor, Richard Mansfield, be Jack the Ripper because he was so scary on stage? So again, we've got a visualized popular culture form of the male vampire. And into this context, of course, we get Dracula, first produced, published in 1897. It doesn't originally start out with illustrations. When they do start, they come slowly. But guess what? They often have the cape. Now, in the book, there is very little about the cape. The assumption is, after we first meet Dracula in his home country, in the castle, when he's an old man with a white moustache and mysteriously hairy hands, all dressed in black. Afterwards, he presumably looks like every other, well-bred gent on the streets of London. Whether he has a red lining to his cloak, we don't know, but I suspect not. But in the book, we do get a moment where he's seen crawling, not like a bat, like a lizard, down the wall of a tower, how do you make that visual? Let's give him a big cloak, which looks a bit like bat wings. And that is, you've already seen this one, but one of the best known covers for the Rider edition, and Dracula has a splendid cloak. Now, there is another element in this mixture, which is the real life Dracula. He was not a vampire. He was a Valetian warlord. His father was Vlad Dracul, which is a kind of nickname. Dracul means dragon. It did not mean the man was a demon or a vampire. It meant he was the order of the Christian Order of the Dragon, which was Christian rulers trying to keep the Ottoman Turks out of their territory. His son, Vlad Chepesh, the gentleman here, was therefore known as Little Dragon, Dracula. I don't think there's much of him in the novel at all, except perhaps for the setting. But remember, Stoker never went to Transylvania, so that's imagined. We know originally Stoker didn't have a name for his count. In the original, the first copies, the first notes we have, handwritten, and by the way, Stoker's writing is illegible, but in the first notes we have, it's Count Vampire. Vampire being the title of the Polidori short story I mentioned earlier. But later on, he clearly picks up on this wonderful name. That's what he takes from history, the name and the setting, not really the Valetian warlord, who was, by all accounts, a very nasty piece of work, and if we can believe all those accounts, probably psychopathic. However, most of the accounts are written by his political enemies, so I wouldn't draw too many conclusions from that. But we do have that. Certainly later on, people will attempt to mix this into the pudding that is Count Dracula. Right. Dracula has already been on stage. Well, has he? The vampire, the Polidori, has been on stage. But Dracula, Stoker, I think, wanted it to be a play, and I suspect he wanted Irving to play Dracula. But all he managed, as we've been told, was a read-through of a hastily written dramatization at the Lyceum to preserve his copyright. Copyright becomes an issue because after Stoker's death, we get the movie, Murnau's movie, Nosferatu, based on Dracula, and it hasn't complied with copyright laws, and Stoker's widow wants to get all copies destroyed. Luckily, it doesn't succeed. But what happens in that movie? It's a curious invention. It's not the Byronic vampire, and it's not the peasant vampire. It's as if Murnau is tapping another concept, and it's what I call the goblin vampire. Nosferatu wouldn't really pass in popular society with those teeth, like rabbit teeth at the front of his mouth and the long fingers. He is made grotesque. It's part of the German expressionist visual tradition, but also perhaps drawing on German folklore. So Nosferatu gives us a really ratty-looking vampire. Count Orlok, he was called politely, because they couldn't call him Count Dracula. That concept, the goblin vampire, does occasionally resurface. As you probably know, there's a remake of Nosferatu coming out very, very soon, so it'll be interesting to see whether they succumb to the desire to romanticize and Byronize him, or whether he remains really, really ratty. But there's been a remake already by Werner Herzog, starring Klaus Kinski. Yes, Kinski. Not as tall and thin as Max Schreck, who's the actor who played it in the original. And there's also been a rather good film called Shadow of the Vampire, which is a fiction around the making of the original Nosferatu with John Malkovich and Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe as Max Schreck. Is he an actor, or is he in fact a real vampire? And bless him, he wore the horrible makeup. He's here interviewing the actor playing Jonathan Harker, who you'll probably recognize as Eddie Izzard, who is a pretty good actor, now sometimes called Susie. There's Defoe. He's not quite as ratty as Max Schreck. And as I say, every so often someone decides, I want to go down that path. I don't want him as the beautiful aristocrat. So occasionally, as here from Salem's Lot, the dramatization of the Stephen King novel, we've got Reggie Nolder as a Nosferatu kind of vampire. And in Buffy, we have a recurring character called the Master, played by Mark McManus, and he's closer to that kind as well. Right. We're moving on to Hollywood now. We're not going straight to Dracula, though. Other people have a go at the vampire. And this is a particularly telling one. It starred Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces, who's, of course, Phantom of the Opera. It was directed by Todd Browning. And it's a story which is actually not about a vampire. It's about someone who pretends to be a vampire. What was he going to make him look like? He didn't want to make him look like Nosferatu, the German version. And he didn't want him not to be scary, so he's not going to be beautiful and aristocratic. So he had poor Lon Chaney wearing this very bizarre and rather ugly makeup. And, of course, a cape that looks like bat wings. So you've got the best of both worlds. And you can see that Lon Chaney was hamming it up no end.
Sorry, when is that from? What year?
It was 27, the silent version. It was remade in 35 as Mark of the Vampire, which is a lost movie. Of course, Todd Browning had also famously directed the film Freaks, which would now be completely politically incorrect, which is about the denizens of a freak show, very sympathetically shown. So he is into the cinema of freakishness, which is why in London After Midnight, Chaney looks so weird, but also in the film, he's someone wearing a disguise. And then, of course, we get to the dramatization, the actual dramatization into a workable form of Stoker's Dracula. And as you know, first performance is in Derby. This is the second actor playing Dracula on stage, Raymond Huntley. And he's got a cape. And there is a story that Huntley had to provide his own evening clothes on the assumption that every gentleman would have a full set of evening clothes. We do not know what colour the lining of the cape was. But if it was, a real set of evening clothes, I doubt it was blood red, but it remains a possibility. It's not shown. And then, of course, that goes on, becomes hugely popular, and it gets picked up in Hollywood. And 1931, by this time we're into talkies, we get a film. It's the first Universal horror film. Again, it's actually directed by Todd Browning, and it uses Bela Lugosi, who had played the role in the Hamilton adaptation in America, not in England at this stage. He would later go on to play it all over the place. And the cloak is so important. I wonder in the 30s how many of the original audience could have gone home and would have had a beautiful opera cloak in their wardrobe. I suspect only those of a certain social and financial standing. But it becomes a signifier of the vampire, which is funny because Uncle Fred mouldering in his grave in Serbia or wherever certainly wouldn't have had anything like that in his wardrobe. And we actually get the reconstruction of Dracula, of the vampire, as someone who is seen as aristocratic. We're back to the Byronic concept, only now it's been remodeled, not so much in the 1890s mode of the novel, but in the 1930s mode of Todd Browning's movie. So he becomes glamorous. He's a kind of Rudolph Valentino with a very strange accent. He's got money, he's got style, he could, pass in any circumstances, and he's got a lot of brilliantine on his hair. And there he is in quite romantic mode, carrying off one of the heroines. And we also get these wonderful ladies who were the vampiric brides in exquisite long gowns. Whoops. This is the most tricksy bloody... Oh, right. Anyway, there he is. Oh, sorry, one of the vampiric brides, by the way, used to work as the stand-in body double for Marlene Dietrich. I thought you'd like that piece of trivia. This is Lugosi practicing his stare. Lugosi had previously on stage played Jesus Christ. I just throw that in as he was, he'd played that in, probably in Budapest. Bidding you welcome. When they were making this version of Dracula, they shot two different versions on the same set. This was not uncommon to shoot a Spanish language version of a film for the Latino South American audience. This was done in several cases. Often they don't survive. But the one of Dracula does survive. It had a completely different cast and, as I say, different language. And the gentleman playing Dracula Carlos Villarius perhaps isn't as compelling as Bela Lugosi, but he's got the cape. It was probably the very same cape, just passed from one actor to another. So there is another version. By the way, the Spanish language version has a much sexier female lead. From this point on, Dracula becomes a franchise for Universal. They have different actors playing the roles, some of them not very well suited to it physically, such as Lon Chaney Jr., who was quite a sort of husky bloke, but they've all got the cape, so they must be Dracula. We've got a symbol that stands in for the character. It's John Carradine playing it in this version. There's Carradine again. And even down to Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, where the cape is paramount. Once we get on to the Hammer movies, starting in the 50s, Christopher Lee was a very tall actor, and the cape was perfect. But also, Hammer wanted to make a point that they were doing it in colour. Their blood was going to be red. So at some point during the series, the cape has a red lining, which tends to have stuck. So we now have a fashion statement defining our vampire. And you can get it all over the place. This is Grandpa from the Munsters, Al Lewis. Sometimes you do get a variation. This is a television version. Sorry, I think it was made for television originally, but it's an American film, Jack Palance, and he did it all in black, which is how Stoker actually mentions it in the novel. But by and large, any subsequent dramatizations, basically, they're going to be the aristocratic, evening-suited type. There's Denham Elliott on British TV, and there's Louis Jourdain, also British TV. David Niven, in a film which has had various titles. It was released in Britain as Vampira. It was made in 1974. But one of the alternative titles was rather unaffectionately Old Dracula, because Niven was an elderly actor, or Times Are Hard for Dracula. In 1972, it was part of a range of films which was specifically aimed at a black audience, so they became very popular elsewhere, in which they took standard cinematic tropes and recast them with black actors in a black American environment. The most popular one would be Shaft, the Richard Roundtree movie. But this was a film called Blackula, very originally, starring William Marshall as a black Dracula. Now, they obviously wanted a variation, so he had a blue lining to his cloak. This is a small plastic figure of Blackula. The version that was being mentioned earlier, the Edward Gorey designed version, was originally a stage version in America, starring Frank Langella. And you can see from Gorey's design, he is very happy with the bat-winged cape. He reset it into the 1920s. If you look at the costumes of the women, it's easier to see that. So he was playing games with it. It was sort of translated into a film, again starring Frank Langella, with Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing. John Badham directed it in 1979. But this is a very dark film, I mean physically dark. It is actually set in Whitby, whereas of course the stage play isn't. The stage play is set in a drawing room, essentially. But we've still got the cape. And when we get the send-ups, we get the cape. This is Love at First Bite, as has been mentioned. This one is The Monster Squad, the Fred Dekker movie, which is actually very good, it has to be said, 1989. And we've got, well, you can see who Dracula is. He's got everything he needs. He's got a frilly shirt and a medallion and a cape. That's it. You've got all the signs. The one that attempts to be a game changer visually is Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. And this had costume designs by Iko Ishioka, who also designed the opening ceremony for the Beijing Olympics in 2008. They often have a slightly Chinese or Japanese, it's not very specific, kind of feel to them. And also, we have Dracula in various different guises in this. We don't just have the one iconic figure in the cape. It's Gary Oldman, who is the kind of actor who can vanish completely into a role. And here he is as Vlad Tepes, the warlord, who in this film is the origin of Dracula, wearing a very curious piece of armor that looks a bit like a flayed body, but could also perhaps reflect Japanese armor types. And is obviously a nod back to the one portrait we have of the man who was called Dracula. But that film also has this wonderful kimono-like dressing gown and this very strange hairdo, which is worn when Dracula first appears. So clearly, this film is doing the aristocratic thing, but it's taking on board the otherness. This is a very Eastern, non-Western kind of Dracula. He also, when he comes to London, wears fashionable clothes to look anonymous. Believe me, you would not have looked anonymous dressed like this. He looks like an absolute dandy, but, you know, I can see the game that's being played. He also gets younger in the film, and this is mentioned in the novel Dracula, although it doesn't seem to be a huge plot point. And also, we get him very definitely appearing in non-human or semi-human form. Otherwise, we have various changes that come in. Later films play on the fact of what we already know. It's not funny to send it up unless you know what's being sent up. So we get films where you have a vampire in Brooklyn, the notion being, dear God, you wouldn't have a vampire in Brooklyn. And this is Eddie Murphy. He's still got the cape. And, very good looking and charismatic. This is Wes Craven. Suave and mysterious. But, of course, it's a big break that we've got a black Dracula. It starts with Blackula, but now we kind of accept that vampire mythology, which probably doesn't have its roots in any kind of African, there may be blood-sucking demons in African religion, but this is essentially an Eastern European idea. We now accept that, anyone can become a vampire irrespective of race and social status. It's an equal opportunities game these days, thank heavens. So we've got Eddie Murphy. You may have noticed, you probably all know Anne Rice's book, Interview with a Vampire, and the movie with Tom Cruise in it, where everyone is very dandified. In the television series, they've brought the action forward a little bit into the 20th century, into the sort of 1910s, 1920s. We've got the era of Prohibition, and we've got black actors interacting as they would socially. And we've actually got the issue of racial prejudice coming up in it, which is, don't dislike the man because he's black. You may dislike him because he's a vampire. These are very, distinct distinctions. We're so rooted in the vampire mystique that we actually want to dramatize the bits that don't usually get so much attention. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was aimed at a youth audience. It was aimed at the kind of audience that was watching high school romance movies. So that's what Buffy is. It's a high school romance series. It's about a young female fashion-conscious vampire slayer. It does have male vampires. They are good looking. It's interesting. They don't, by and large, wear capes, except for the one she meets in one episode who says, yes, I am the original Count Dracula. He has a cape. But if you know the series, you will notice long black leather coats are pretty much de rigueur for the boy vampires. Otherwise, we have now moved them away from that. But we can do that because we know the stereotype. We get vampire dramas where they tend to be young, they tend to be seductive. There's a lot about sex and romantic relationships. This is from the Vampire Diaries, something like Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series. But we also now, we can play other games. True Blood was mentioned. Oops. Yeah. True Blood is a bit more of a down-home kind of vampire story. You go out to the diner and what are you buying in that can of booze? Well, that's interesting. So we can, of course, now also slightly reclaim poor old Uncle Fred. We have some dramas which are about the vampire who does look like the neighbour who died, or it could be someone you grew up with. So that's another game to play. And several films like From Dusk Till Dawn play on that notion of the vampires who look more or less like real people. But there are other variations. If you're a writer, knowing that there's a convention is like opening a door, because you can know that convention and you can ignore it, you can play games with it, you can reinvent it. Here's a nice example, the Discworld novels of Terry Pratchett. This one, Carpe Jugulum, which translates as go for the throat, is about Discworld vampires, and they do not have a Count Vampire, they have a Count Magpie, and their symbol is the magpie. So that is a very telling way of doing a twist on it. Another thing that happens is as the vampire becomes a recognizable trope, he turns up in all kinds of unlikely places. Do you think that Stoker would ever have imagined his Dracula would be on a postage stamp? What logic would it have seemed in the 80s? Do you think the Styrian peasant in the 17th century ever thought Uncle Fred would turn up on a postage stamp? Well, he doesn't, but his literary descendant, Count Dracula, does. We also get the vampire, because he's recognizable, being repackaged for children. This is a children's book. And again, I think people might have been quite taken with the notion that he has become something that you can feed to kiddies. Well, what do you do on Halloween? As Halloween becomes a more and more commercial feast or festival, it requires more and more merchandising. So you start thinking, well, what can we sell them? It's not just pumpkins and bobbing for apples anymore. Let's bring in the vampire. And here is another child-friendly version, the Universal movies Monsters. As a set, there have been many such sets, including, well, you know who we're looking at. Occasionally, we get someone who, I shouldn't say this because this person is still alive and is very litigious. You get someone who takes it for real. This is the Reverend Sean Manchester, Bishop of the Grail Church of Glastonbury. If you haven't heard of the Grail Church, there's a very good reason for that, and you can probably imagine what it is. Sean Manchester, who considers himself a descendant of Lord Byron, sees himself as a Byronic character, and he kind of marketed himself as Britain's great vampire hunter. This was before Buffy, by the way. He wasn't trying to be a Valley girl. And he would, despite the fact he was the Van Helsing character, he would wear frilly shirts and, Byronic gear. And here he is, having decided he's actually going to become a cleric in a church of his own invention. Gave it away there. Here he is fighting off a bat. This is a real photograph. You can see that by the size of the bat, can't you? But he's playing the mythology, and he's aware of the Byronic element. He's just applied it to a different character because he has to be the good guy. Anne Rice, Interview with the Vampire, that is actually in the tradition of Dracula, the novel. But she extends her vampire mythology. Where did vampires start? And she has them starting in ancient Egypt. So very briefly, you start getting vampires who look Egyptian. I don't think there's any other basis for this, but this is from the film of Queen of the Damned. It's Alicia, the singer, who unfortunately died, I think, even before the film was released, playing the original vampire queen. And very briefly, wannabe lookalike vampire goths decided they could be Egyptian too. This is from a magazine called Bloodstone, the magazine for vampires. And we've got Louis, who was one of the leading proponents, as an Egyptian vampire, and a nicely doctored image of the Mask of Tutankhamun with fangs added. That didn't last long, but it's out there in the mixture. It could come back again. We also have another kind of merchandising. If you go to Romania, there's a sort of on-off relationship with Count Dracula, because they want to celebrate Vlad Tepes. He wasn't very nice, but they want to celebrate him. He was a national hero, fighting to keep the Ottoman Turks out. But at the same time, they're aware that people want Dracula, who isn't really the same person. This is a souvenir from Romania, and it's pretty straightforward. It's like, buying a little model of Queen Elizabeth I or Henry VIII or whoever your hero happens to be. This one, he's on a throne. He looks as if he's drunk on blood, and it says Dracula. They've obviously sort of changed This I bought in Romania. And it's amazing because it doesn't look like the portrait of Vlad Tepes. It doesn't look like a Wallachian warlord. It looks like a sort of peasant-made version of Bela Lugosi. In terms of popular culture, you get all kinds of keepsakes. Dracula has become something for your mantelpiece, and that's because we have a sequence of symbols we can use. This is obviously a Dracula gravestone. You get people going up to St. Mary's Church in Whitby, where part of the novelist set, and saying, "Where's Dracula buried?" And there are several answers to that. We used to just send them to the shop, which sold these. You can see his gravestone, and unfortunately they've stopped doing them. But it's got a sort of bat on the top. And you also get the bat shown as vampiric, but not like the real vampire bat. Very decorative. Again, we've got the red lining here. I think I'm right in saying this one is the Marks and Spencer's bat, and this one is the IKEA bat. We also have the Dracula table napkin for Halloween feasts. How can you show a vampire? If you look at the beliefs, there is no particular look for a vampire. They are someone you knew who has come back. It's the literary, it's the dramatic, it's the cinematic, and ultimately it's the merchandising cultures which have told us we will recognize a vampire wherever we see one, which will make life very much easier. When we are dressing our kids for Halloween, they can go as the Bela Lugosi type. Well, they can play with the bat motif. We can also, of course, dress our pets in the Dracula cape. You do know how these costumes work. This dog has not been cut in half, let me promise you. Front legs are down there. I just want to make sure you know that. Oh, this is Nosferatu the vampire, or Mouseferatu. Snoopy as a vampire. I think they had Snoopy as Zorro dolls and decided to repurpose them. Dracula doesn't usually have a mask. The Count, of course, from Sesame Street. But we also then have jokes. This is an advert. Are you making full use of your card? It was for the Visa Delta card. It was a count. Really? Seriously? And you get endlessly turning up in political cartoons. You probably won't remember who these two people were, John Major and John Redwood. But you'll know it's a vampire. You'll get the basic joke, even if you have no idea who they were. And we also, this is just bizarre. Teach your kids to be safe. Learn the Dracula move. What is this talking about? Well, there used to be a slogan, coughs and sneezes spread diseases. And kids were obviously growing up without knowing how to use a handkerchief. And this seriously says, get them to the way Dracula does with his cape. So we have the boy next door, though he's usually rather glamorized. We do have some scruffy down-home vampires, but basically we have spun a construction that fulfills our needs with a little bit of Lord Byron, a tiny bit of Vlad Tepes, and an awful lot of Bram Stoker, Henry Irving, whoever wanted to do the stage play, etc. We even now have vampire hunting kits. Are they genuine? Well, they're objects. They're genuine material objects. They may have old pistols in them, but no, of course they're not genuine. Don't be silly. We also have literature actually predicting real life, which is weird. This is a children's book called The Fantastic Adventures of Dracula's Dentures. And it's about the notion of a Dracula theme park in Romania. And some years after this was published, there was a very serious idea of having one for the tourist trade in Romania. We never discovered whether it was going to be about the cinematic vampire Dracula or whether it was going to be about Vlad Tepes, the Wallachian national hero, but it never happened, I'm quite relieved to say. But we also still play the games. What we do in the shadows. Yeah, we've got a psychic vampire dressed very ordinarily, and we've got a wannabe with a nice range of woolly jumpers. Guillermo wears lovely jumpers, but the others are playing variations on the vampire cloak, on something rather Eastern and Oriental. This one is more or less defined as Persian. And we also just get Dracula used as a shorthand term. This was about the erosion of the cliff where St. Mary's Church stands in Whitby. But how did they actually describe it? Whitby lands, exposes human bones at Dracula graveyard. So Dracula is a shorthand for anything to do with any part of the legend. And I will end with this as a tribute to the late Loki, who was forced into this costume by his loving owner and had shredded it 30 seconds after this photo was taken. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. We have reached the end of our mini symposium. Is that fair to say? Would you say? Can we have a final round of applause for all our speakers? As Matt said, for those who may not know me, my name is Dan Webber, and I have the best job title in the world because I am the Dracula Events Specialist, which is the coolest thing on an email I've ever put, believe me. Thank you for supporting the event. Thank you for supporting Derby Museums. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. For those who may be interested, we are back next weekend on the 23rd of November with a fantastic double bill as part of our Dracula Returns to Derby event, with Minima performing live music to two classic silent films, The Phantom of the Opera and, of course, the one and only Nosferatu. If you have signed up to receive emails from us, you'll get information about these imminently. If you'd like to fill out any information about the Dracula Project or being human, there's stuff on the bar. There's lots of biscuits. Please eat biscuits. The more you take, the more you eat, the less I've got to take home. So thank you for coming. Can we have a round of applause for our fabulous live streamers as well? Thank you very much. To everyone involved, both the Being Human and Dracula Returns to Derby projects, thank you very much. Travel safely, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.